Tom Reynolds pulled his battered pickup truck off the narrow mountain road, the gravel crunching beneath its tires as he eased into a small clearing. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, inhaling deeply. The crisp Adirondack air filled, his lungs carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. At 50 years old, Tom had been making this annual pilgrimage for over 2 decades, but the excitement never diminished. He stepped out of the truck, stretching his back with a satisfying pop. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. Tom walked to the truck bed, running his hand along the worn edge as he surveyed his gear. Another year, another adventure, he murmured to himself, a smile tugging at the corners of his weathered face. Tom began unloading his equipment with practiced efficiency. His trusty tent, a compact 2-person model that had weathered countless storms, came out first. Next, he hefted his backpack, laden with supplies for the week ahead. Finally, he carefully removed his prized fly fishing rod, examining it with reverence. As he set up camp, Tom's mind wandered to the pristine stream that lay just beyond the tree line. He could almost hear the gentle gurgle of water over smooth. Stones could almost feel the cool rush against his waders. But there would be time for that tomorrow. Tonight was for settling in, for reacquainting himself with the rhythms of the forest. The tent went up quickly, muscle memory guiding Tom's hands as he secured guy lines and drove stakes into the soft earth. He arranged his sleeping bag and gear, inside creating a cozy haven for the nights ahead. Outside, he set up a small camp stove and began unpacking his food supplies. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, Tom lit a small campfire. He sat back in his folding chair, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest come alive with nighttime sounds. Crickets began their evening chorus, accompanied by the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Tom reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a battered leather wallet. From it he extracted a faded photograph. The image showed a younger version of himself, standing proudly next to an equally younger man. Both were grinning widely, holding up an impressive rainbow trout between them. "Wish you were here, Dad," Tom said softly, running his thumb over the photograph. "You'd love how peaceful it still is." He tucked the photo away and turned his attention to dinner. As he heated up a can of hearty stew, Tom's mind drifted to the week ahead. He had meticulously planned this trip, studying water levels and hatch reports, tying custom flies to match the local insect population. Tomorrow he'd wake before dawn and make his way to his favorite spot on the stream. As night fell in earnest, Tom doused the fire and retreated to his tent. He lay on his sleeping bag, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sleep came easily, his dreams filled with the promise of silvery fish and sun-dappled water. The sharp cry of a blue jay roused Tom from his slumber. He blinked, awake, momentarily disoriented by the green walls of his tent. Then, as awareness returned, a childlike excitement flooded through him. It was fishing day. Tom dressed quickly, layering up against the early morning chill. He emerged from his tent, to find the world shrouded in a light mist, giving the forest an almost ethereal quality. He breathed deeply, savoring the moment. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee, Tom gathered his gear. He double-checked his fly box, making sure he had a good selection of nymphs, dry flies, and streamers. His waders went on next, followed by his vest, each pocket filled with the tools of his passion. As he made his way through the underbrush towards the stream, Tom's anticipation grew. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step, until finally he broke through the tree line and beheld the object of his devotion. The stream stretched out before him, a ribbon of crystal-clear water winding its way through the rocky landscape. Early morning sunlight glinted off its surface, creating a dazzling display. Tom paused, drinking in the sight, feeling a profound sense of connection to this wild place. "Well, hello there, old friend," he said softly, addressing the stream as if greeting a long-lost companion. "Let's see what you've got for me today." Tom waded in carefully, feeling the familiar push of the current against his legs. He moved slowly, scanning the water for signs of fish. A subtle ripple caught his eye, and he began to work out line from his reel. With a graceful flick of his wrist, Tom sent his fly arcing through the air. It landed delicately on the water's surface, drifting naturally with the current. He watched, intently ready for any sign of interest from below. Hours passed in a blissful blur. Tom lost himself in the rhythm of casting, the interplay of light on water, the subtle tug of a fish taking his fly. He caught and released several smaller trout, enjoying their spirited fights, but hoping for something more substantial. As the sun climbed higher, Tom decided to take a break. He made his way back to the bank, finding a comfortable spot on a sun-warmed rock. From his vest, he produced a simple lunch of jerky and trail mix. As he ate, he scanned the surrounding forest, appreciating its rugged beauty. It was then that a flicker of movement caught his eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush on the opposite bank. Tom's heart quickened as he strained to get a better look. Could it be a deer? Or perhaps... The thought was left unfinished as a massive black shape emerged from the trees. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. A black bear, its fur glistening in the sunlight, ambled down to the water's edge. Tom remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. He knew that black bears were generally shy creatures, more likely to avoid humans than confront them. Still, the sight of such a powerful animal sent a thrill of both excitement and fear through him. The bear seemed unaware of Tom's presence. It lowered its head to the water, lapping noisily. Tom watched in awe, feeling privileged to witness such a moment. After a few minutes, the bear lifted its head, shook itself, and lumbered back into the forest. Once he was sure the bear was gone, Tom let out a long, shaky breath. "Well, that's not something you see every day," he said to himself, chuckling nervously. The encounter left him feeling exhilarated, reminding him of the raw, untamed nature of this place he loved so much. As the afternoon wore on, Tom returned to his fishing. The memory of the bear sighting added an extra layer of alertness to his movements. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more frequently, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Just as he was considering calling it a day, Tom felt a solid strike on his line. He set the hook and immediately knew this was the fish he'd been waiting for. The rod bent dramatically as the unseen trout fought with all its might. "Oh, you're a fighter, aren't you?" Tom grinned, skillfully playing the fish. He maneuvered it away from snags and rocks, slowly but surely tiring it out. After a thrilling battle, Tom finally brought the trout to his net. It was a beautiful specimen, its speckled flanks flashing in the late afternoon light. Tom quickly measured and photographed his prize before gently releasing it back into the stream. As he watched the trout swim away, Tom felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. This was why he came here year after year, not just for the fishing, but for moments like these, moments of connection with nature, of challenge and reward, of solitude and reflection. With the sun beginning to dip towards the horizon, Tom decided to head back to camp. He made his way along the bank, his mind already turning to thoughts of dinner and a warm sleeping bag. The day had been everything he'd hoped for, and more. Little did Tom know that his true test, his moment of reckoning with the wild, was yet to come. The Adirondacks held one more surprise for him, one that would forever change his relationship with this place he called his second home. The next morning, Tom awoke before dawn, his body humming with anticipation. He unzipped his tent and stepped out into the cool, misty air. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of an early rising bird. Tom took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air that filled his lungs. "Today's the day," he murmured, said to himself, a grin spreading across his face. "I can feel it." After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a granola bar, Tom gathered his gear. He double-checked his fly box, making sure he had a good selection for whatever the stream might throw at him. As he pulled on his waders, he went over his mental checklist one last time. The trek to his favorite fishing spot took about 20 minutes. Tom moved quietly through the underbrush, his senses alert to the awakening forest around him. As he neared the stream, the sound of rushing water grew louder, quickening his pulse with excitement. Breaking through the tree line, Tom paused to take in the scene before him. The stream stretched out like a silver ribbon, its surface broken by occasional ripples and eddies. Mist hung low over the water, giving the whole area an almost mystical quality. Tom waded in carefully, feeling the familiar push of the current. against his legs. He moved slowly, scanning the water for signs of fish. A subtle movement caught his eye, the telltale sign of a trout rising to snatch an insect from the surface. "There you are," Tom whispered, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He began to work out his line, the familiar rhythm of casting settling over him like a comfortable blanket. The first cast landed a bit short, but Tom adjusted quickly. His second cast was perfect, the fly landing delicately on the water's surface, just upstream of where he'd seen the rise. For hours, Tom lost himself in the zen-like state that only fly fishing could bring. The world narrowed down to the arc of his cast, the drift of his fly and the occasional flash of a trout beneath the surface. He caught and released several fish, each one bringing a surge of joy and accomplishment. As the sun climbed higher, in the sky, Tom decided to move upstream to a deeper pool he knew often held larger fish. He picked his way carefully along the rocky bank, his eyes never leaving the water for long. Reaching the pool, Tom paused to observe. The water here was darker, moving more slowly than in the rapids he'd just left. He knew from experience that the bigger trout often lurked in such places, waiting for an easy meal to drift by. Tom selected a new fly from his box, a large, bushy, dry fly that imitated a mayfly. He tied it on with practiced ease, his fingers moving almost of their own accord. Taking a deep breath, he began to cast. The first few casts yielded nothing, but Tom was patient. He knew that success in fly fishing often came down to persistence and timing. On his fifth cast, just as the fly hit the water, there was a sudden violent splash. Tom's heart leapt as he set the hook. Immediately, he knew this was no ordinary trout. The rod bent dramatically, the line singing as it cut through the water. The fish dove deep, using the current to its advantage. "Oh, you're a big one, aren't you?" Tom grinned, his voice a mix of excitement and concentration. For the next 15 minutes, Tom was locked in an intense battle of wills with the unseen fish. Every time he thought he was making progress, the trout would make another run, stripping. Line from his reel. Tom's arms began to ache, but he didn't dare ease up. Finally, after what felt like hours, Tom caught his first glimpse of the fish as it broke the surface. It was, without a doubt, the largest trout he'd ever hooked in these waters. The sight of it sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through him. With renewed determination, Tom worked the fish closer to the bank. His net seemed woefully inadequate as he maneuvered it into position. After a few tense moments, he managed to scoop the massive trout into the net. "I can't believe it," Tom breathed, his hands shaking slightly as he admired his catch. The trout was a beautiful specimen, its flanks gleaming with a rainbow of colors. He estimated it to be at least 24 inches long, a true trophy by any standard. Carefully, Tom removed the hook and took a quick measurement and photo. As much as part of him wanted to keep this magnificent fish, he knew the right thing to do was to release it. Gently, he lowered the trout back into the water, supporting it until it regained its strength. "Thank you for the fight," Tom said softly as the fish swam away. "May you make some other angler's day someday." Elated by his success, Tom decided to take a break. He found a comfortable spot on the bank and sat down, pulling out the sandwich he'd packed for lunch. As he ate, he replayed the fight in his mind, still buzzing from the excitement. The afternoon passed in a blur of casts and smaller catches, but nothing could compare to the monster trout from earlier. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, Tom decided to call it a day. He made his way back to his campsite, his creel heavy with a few smaller trout he'd kept for dinner. The forest seemed different now, charged with a new energy. Or perhaps it was Tom himself who had changed, buoyed by his incredible catch. Back at camp, Tom set about cleaning his catch. He worked efficiently, scaling and gutting the fish with practiced movements. As he worked, he found himself humming softly, still riding high on the day's success. The smell of frying fish soon filled the air, making Tom's stomach growl in anticipation. He seasoned the fillets with a simple blend of salt, pepper, and lemon he'd brought from home. As the fish sizzled in the pan, Tom reflected on the day. Not bad for a day's work, he chuckled to himself, flipping the fillets. After dinner, Tom sat by his small campfire, sipping from a flask of whiskey he allowed himself on special occasions. The warmth of the fire and the alcohol spread through him, mixing with the contentment of a successful day on the water. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Tom's thoughts turned to the next day. He was eager to get back to the stream to see if he could replicate his success. But even if he didn't catch another fish the entire trip, he knew he'd always have the memory of that monster trout. Little did Tom know that his perfect day of fishing was about to take a dark turn. As he drifted off to sleep that night, dreams of leaping trout dancing in his head, he was blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the flickering light of his dying campfire. The scent of his fish dinner, carried on the gentle night breeze, had attracted an unexpected visitor. In the dense underbrush, a pair of dark eyes gleamed, nostrils flaring as they caught the tantalizing aroma. The black bear that Tom had glimpsed the day before had returned, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. As Tom slept peacefully in his tent, the bear began to cautiously approach the campsite. The stage was set for a confrontation that would forever change Tom's relationship with the wilderness he loved so dearly. The next morning, Tom woke with the first light of dawn, his body still buzzing from the previous day's success. He stretched, wincing slightly at the soreness in his arms from the epic battle with the trophy trout. As he unzipped his tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air, he noticed something amiss. His campsite, which he always kept meticulously tidy, was in disarray. The remains of last night's dinner were scattered about, and his cooler lay on its side, its contents strewn across the forest floor. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, his brow furrowing as he surveyed the damage. As he began to clean up, a chill ran down his spine. Large, distinctive paw prints were clearly visible in the soft earth around his campsite. The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. A bear had visited during the night. Tom's mind raced back to the bear he'd seen by the stream 2 days ago. Could it be the same one? He chastised himself for not being more careful with his food storage. In his elation over the day's fishing, he'd gotten careless. Despite the unsettling start to the morning, Tom was determined not to let it ruin his day. He quickly repacked what food hadn't been destroyed and secured it properly in his truck. Then, after a hasty breakfast of what remained of his granola bars, he gathered his fishing gear. As he made his way to the stream, Tom found himself constantly scanning the forest around him, hyper-aware of every sound and movement. The peaceful solitude he usually cherished now felt charged with potential danger. Reaching the water's edge, Tom took a deep breath, trying to shake off his unease. He waded in, the familiar feel of the current against his legs, helping to calm his nerves. As he began to cast, the rhythmic motion slowly brought him back to center. Hours passed and Tom's initial anxiety faded as he lost himself in the act of fishing. He caught several nice trout, though none to rival yesterday's monster. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, he decided to break for lunch. Finding a comfortable spot on the bank, Tom sat down and opened his pack. He pulled out a sandwich and a bottle of water, grateful he'd thought to bring them with him rather than leaving them at the campsite. As he ate, Tom's gaze wandered across the stream, taking in the beauty of the Adirondack wilderness. The sunlight dappled through the leaves, creating shifting patterns on the water's surface. Birds called to each other in the trees, their songs mingling with the gentle gurgle of the stream. Suddenly, a sound caught Tom's attention, a rustling in the underbrush on the opposite bank. His heart rate quickened as he remembered the bear prints from this morning. He set his sandwich down slowly, his eyes fixed on the spot where he'd heard the noise. For a long moment, nothing happened. Tom began to think he'd imagined it, that his earlier scare had made him jumpy. Then, with a crash that seemed deafening in the relative quiet of the forest, a massive shape burst through the foliage. Tom's breath caught in his throat. There, not 50 yards away, stood the black bear. It was even larger than he remembered, its black fur gleaming in the sunlight. The bear's nose twitched as it sniffed the air, and with a jolt of fear, Tom realized it had likely smelled his food. Time seemed to stand still as Tom and the bear regarded each other. Tom's mind raced, trying to remember everything he'd ever learned about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Make noise. Slowly, Tom began to stand, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. His hand inched towards the bear, spray attached to his vest, a precaution he'd always taken but never thought he'd need to use. "Hey there, big guy," Tom said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the fear coursing through him. "No need to come any closer. Why don't you just head on back into the woods, huh?" The bear, however, seemed to have other ideas. It took a step forward, then another, its powerful form moving with a grace that belied its size. Tom's fingers closed around the bear spray, his thumb finding the safety latch. "That's far enough," Tom called out, his voice stronger now. He slowly raised his arms, trying to make himself appear larger. "Go on now, get out of here." For a moment it seemed to work. The bear paused, tilting its head as if confused by Tom's display. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for such a large animal, it charged. Tom's world narrowed to a pinpoint of focus. He raised the bear spray, aiming it at the oncoming wall of fur and muscle. Just as the bear entered the spray's effective range, Tom squeezed the trigger. A cloud of orange mist erupted from the canister, engulfing the bear's face. The effect was immediate. The bear reared up on its hind legs, pawing at its eyes and nose. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, a sound of pain and confusion that Tom knew would haunt his dreams for years to come. Taking advantage of the bear's disorientation, Tom began to back away slowly. His legs felt like lead, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He kept the bear spray raised, ready to fire again if needed. The bear, still clearly distressed from the spray, turned and crashed back into the underbrush. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves gradually faded as it moved away from the stream. Tom didn't lower his guard until long after the sounds had disappeared. Only then did he allow himself to collapse onto the rocky shore, his legs finally giving out. He sat there for what felt like hours, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. As the reality of what had just happened sank in, Tom felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Relief at his narrow escape, fear at how close he'd come to serious injury or worse, and surprisingly a deep sense of awe at the raw power and beauty of the creature he'd encountered. Eventually, Tom gathered himself enough to stand. His fishing gear lay scattered where he'd dropped it in the chaos, and he collected it with shaking hands. As much as he loved fishing, he knew he couldn't stay here any longer today. The encounter had left him too shaken. As he made his way back to his campsite, Tom's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he should report the incident to the local rangers. Bears that showed this level of comfort around humans could be dangerous. At the same time, a part of him was reluctant. This was the bear's home, after all. It was Tom who was the intruder. Reaching his camp, Tom quickly packed up his gear. As much as he hated to cut his trip short, he knew it was the sensible thing to do. He'd come too close to disaster today. As he drove away from his cherished fishing spot, Tom felt a complex mix of emotions. The thrill of his record-breaking catch seemed a lifetime ago, overshadowed by the heart-stopping encounter with the bear. Yet as the miles passed and his hammering heart began to slow, Tom found himself already planning his return. This was the wild, after all, unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, but always awe-inspiring. And Tom knew, deep in his bones, that he would always be drawn back to it, bear encounters and all. Tom's heart raced as he stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the wet rocks of the streambed. The massive black bear, seemingly undeterred by his earlier attempt to scare it off, charged forward with shocking speed. Time seemed to slow as Tom's mind frantically searched for a way out of this nightmare scenario. Oh God, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rushing water and the bear's heavy breathing. In his panic, Tom's foot caught on a submerged branch. He lost his balance, arms windmilling wildly as he tried to stay upright. The world tilted and suddenly he was falling. The cold shock of the stream engulfed him as he plunged into the water. For a moment, everything was chaos. The current tugged at him, threatening to sweep him downstream. Tom flailed, trying to find his footing on the slippery riverbed. As he broke the surface, gasping for air, he caught sight of the bear again. It had paused at the water's edge, seeming unsure about following him into the stream. Tom's relief was short-lived. The bear, apparently deciding that its prey was worth the discomfort of getting wet, began to wade into the water. Its powerful form cut through the current with ease, closing the distance between them alarmingly quickly. No, Tom panted, scrambling backward. His waders, now full of water, made movement difficult. He felt like he was trying to run. In a nightmare, his limbs heavy and unresponsive, the bear was upon him before he could fully regain his footing. Tom raised his arms instinctively, trying to protect his face and neck. He felt a searing pain as the bear's claws raked across his forearm, tearing through his jacket and into the flesh beneath. Tom cried out in pain and fear. The sound seemed to startle the bear momentarily, but it quickly recovered. Its massive jaws opened wide, and Tom caught a glimpse of yellowed teeth before feeling an excruciating pressure on his shoulder. The bear's bite was like nothing Tom had ever experienced. It felt as if his entire arm was being crushed in a vice. He screamed, the sound echoing off the trees surrounding the stream. In desperation, he swung his free arm, his fist connecting with the bear's sensitive nose. To Tom's surprise, the bear released its grip. It reared back, shaking its head and letting out a confused growl. Tom didn't waste the opportunity. Ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder and arm, he began to move downstream as quickly as he could manage. "Get away!" Tom yelled, his voice hoarse with pain and fear. He splashed water towards the bear, hoping to further disorient it. The bear, however, wasn't done. It lunged forward again, its powerful paws swiping at Tom. He felt a sharp pain across his back as the claws tore through his jacket and into his skin. The force of the blow sent him stumbling forward, and he went under the water once more. Underwater, Tom's world narrowed to a singular focus: survival. He kicked off from the bottom, propelling himself further downstream. When he surfaced, he was relieved to see that he'd put some distance between himself and the bear. The animal stood in the middle of the stream, watching him intently. It took a few steps in his direction, then paused. Tom held his breath, praying that the bear would lose interest. For what felt like an eternity, bear and man stared at each other. Tom's shoulder throbbed, and he could feel warm blood mixing with the cold stream water. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Finally, miraculously, the bear turned away. It lumbered back to the shore, shook itself vigorously, and disappeared into the underbrush. Tom watched in disbelief, hardly daring to hope that the attack was over. When he was sure the bear was gone, Tom allowed himself to collapse in the shallow water near the bank. The pain, which had been held at bay by adrenaline, now hit him full force. His shoulder felt like it was on fire, and he could feel multiple spots on his back where the bear's claws had torn his skin. "I'm alive," Tom whispered to himself, his voice shaky. "I'm alive." Slowly, carefully, he pulled himself onto the shore. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. Tom knew he needed to assess his injuries and get help, but for the moment he could only lie there, his chest heaving as he gulped in air. After a few minutes, Tom gathered the strength to sit up. He gingerly removed his shredded jacket, wincing. As the fabric pulled away from his wounds, the sight of his injuries made his stomach churn. His shoulder was a mess of torn flesh and bruising, and he could see 4 distinct gashes across his forearm where the bear's claws had caught him. "Okay, Reynolds," he muttered to himself, trying to stay calm. "You've got to get out of here. You've got to get help." Tom knew his campsite wasn't far, but in his current state, it might as well have been miles away. Still, he had no choice. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he struggled to his feet. The trek back to camp was a blur of pain and determination. Tom stumbled more than once, each fall sending fresh agony through his battered body. By the time he reached his tent, he was on the verge of collapse. With shaking hands, Tom retrieved his first aid kit. He did his best to clean and bandage his wounds, but he knew it was far from adequate. He needed proper medical attention, and soon. Tom's truck was parked about a quarter-mile from his campsite. In his current state, the journey seemed almost insurmountable, but the alternative, staying here, bleeding and vulnerable to another bear attack, was unthinkable. Gathering what little strength he had left, Tom began the arduous journey to his vehicle. Each step was an exercise in willpower, his vision blurring at the edges from pain and blood loss. More than once he had to stop and lean against a tree, fighting against the urge to simply lie down and give up. When he finally reached his truck, Tom nearly wept with relief. He climbed into the driver's seat, his movements slow and pained. As he turned the key in the ignition, a wave of dizziness washed over him. "Stay awake," he commanded himself, slapping his cheek with his good hand. "You're not out of this yet. The drive to the nearest town was the longest of Tom's life. He drove one-handed, his injured arm cradled against his chest. Every bump in the road sent fresh spikes of pain through his body. He found himself talking out loud, reciting fishing techniques, anything to keep himself conscious and focused. As he pulled into the parking lot of the small local hospital, Tom's last reserves of strength were fading fast. He stumbled out of his truck, calling weakly for help. The world seemed to tilt and spin around him. The last thing Tom saw before darkness overtook him was a group of people rushing towards him, their faces etched with concern. As consciousness slipped away, a final thought flitted through his mind. Against all odds, he had survived. Tom's world swam back into focus slowly, the sterile white of a hospital room gradually coming into view. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and he became aware of a dull, throbbing pain throughout his body. A steady beeping from nearby machinery punctuated the quiet. "Mr. Reynolds, can you hear me?" A gentle voice broke through the fog in his mind. Tom turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement. A nurse stood beside his bed, her face etched with concern. Where am I?" Tom's voice was hoarse, his throat dry. "You're in Adirondack Medical Center," the nurse replied, adjusting his IV. "You've been unconscious for about 24 hours. Do you remember what happened?" The memories came flooding back in a rush. The fishing trip, the bear, the desperate struggle in the stream. Tom's heart rate spiked, the monitor beside him beeping more rapidly. "The bear," he gasped. "There was a bear." "Easy now," the nurse soothed, placing a calming hand on his uninjured arm. "You're safe here. The doctor will be in shortly to talk to you about your injuries." As if on cue, a middle-aged man in a white coat entered the room, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel and began to explain Tom's condition. "Mr. Reynolds, you've sustained some serious injuries," Dr. Patel began, his tone professional but kind. "The bear's bite caused significant damage to your left shoulder. We've repaired what we could surgically, but you'll need extensive physical therapy. There are also deep lacerations on your back and right arm that required stitches." Tom listened in a daze, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. Will I regain full use of my arm?" he asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Patel's expression softened. "It's too early to say for certain, but with proper rehabilitation, we're hopeful for a good recovery." "You're lucky, Mr. Reynolds. Bear attacks of this severity often have much worse outcomes." As the doctor continued to explain his treatment plan, Tom's mind wandered. He thought of his family back in Albany, his wife Sarah, his daughter Emma. They must be worried sick. "My family," Tom interrupted. "Has anyone contacted them?" The nurse nodded. "Your wife has been notified. She's on her way here now." Relief washed over Tom, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. Sarah had always worried about his solo fishing trips. How many times had she asked him to be careful, to take someone along? And now her worst fears had come true. The next few hours passed in a blur of tests, checkups, and pain medication adjustments. Tom drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with flashing teeth and gleaming claws. He was roused from one such uneasy slumber by a familiar voice. "Tom?" "Oh, thank God." Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry. She rushed to his bedside, carefully taking his hand in hers. "Sarah," Tom croaked, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you." "Shh," she soothed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We can talk about that later. I'm just glad you're alive." As Sarah settled into the chair beside his bed, a park ranger entered the room. He introduced himself as Ranger Mike Johnson. "Mr. Reynolds," the ranger began, "I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you some questions about the attack. It's important we have all the details to ensure the safety of other visitors to the area." Tom nodded weakly, and with Sarah's encouragement, began to recount his harrowing experience. He described the initial sighting of the bear, his attempts to scare it off, and the terrifying moment when it charged. Ranger Johnson listened intently, jotting notes in a small pad. When Tom finished his account, the ranger's brow furrowed. "You said you used bear spray?" he asked. "And it didn't deter the bear?" Tom shook his head. "It seemed to work for a moment, but then it just got angrier." The ranger made another note. That's concerning. A properly used bear spray is usually very effective. We'll need to investigate further. As the ranger prepared to leave, he paused. Mr. Reynolds, I have to ask, did you follow proper food storage protocols at your campsite? Tom felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. I got careless, he admitted. After a good day of fishing, I didn't clean up as thoroughly as I should have. Ranger Johnson's expression was sympathetic but firm. I understand the excitement of a successful trip, but it's crucial to always follow safety guidelines. Bears that associate humans with food can become dangerous repeat offenders. The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. Tom realized that his carelessness might have consequences beyond his own injuries. After the ranger left, Sarah turned to Tom, her eyes brimming with a mix of relief and lingering fear. Promise me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Promise me you won't go out there alone again. Tom squeezed her hand gently. I promise, he replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. The next few days were a whirlwind of medical procedures, visits from friends and family, and sessions with a trauma counselor. Tom's daughter Emma arrived, her usual bubbly personality, subdued by concern for her father. As Tom began to regain his strength, he found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was immensely grateful to be alive, aware of how close he had come to death. On the other, he felt a deep sense of loss. The Adirondacks had been his sanctuary for years, a place of peace and rejuvenation. Now, that sanctuary was tainted by fear and painful memories. One afternoon, as Tom sat in his hospital bed gazing out the window at the distant mountains, a local news reporter stopped by his room. She asked if he'd be willing to share his story. Tom hesitated. Part of him wanted to put the whole ordeal behind him, to forget it had ever happened. But another part recognized the importance of raising awareness about bear safety. All right, he agreed finally. If it might help prevent someone else from going through this, I'll talk. The interview was brief but impactful. Tom spoke candidly about his experience, emphasizing the importance of following proper safety protocols in bear country. He also touched on the complex emotions he was dealing with, the fear, but also the continued respect for the wild beauty of the Adirondacks. As the days passed and Tom's discharge date approached, he found himself thinking more and more about the future. The doctors were optimistic about his recovery, but they warned him that it would be a long and challenging process. Will I ever fish again? Tom asked Dr. Patel during one of their final consultations. The doctor smiled encouragingly. With time and proper rehabilitation, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to return to fishing. But it will take patience, Mr. Reynolds. And perhaps, he added gently, some adjustments to how you approach your hobby. Tom nodded, understanding the unspoken advice. Solo trips into the deep wilderness were likely a thing of the past. But as he contemplated this, Tom realized that the core of what he loved about fishing, the peace, the connection with nature, the challenge, could still be found in safer, more accessible waters. On the day of his discharge, as Sarah helped him into a wheelchair, Tom took one last look at the mountains visible from his hospital window. The sight stirred a mix of emotions, fear, respect, longing. But underneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, a determination, a spark of the resilience that had helped him survive the attack. Ready to go home? Sarah asked, her hand warm on his shoulder. Tom nodded, tearing his gaze away from the window. Ready, he replied. And he was, ready to face the long road of recovery ahead, ready to find a new balance between his love for the wild and the realities of its dangers. As they wheeled out of the hospital, Tom knew that while the bear attack had changed him, it hadn't broken him. The Adirondacks, in all their beauty and danger, would always be a part of him. And someday, when he was healed and strong again, he would return, older, wiser, but still drawn to the timeless allure of the wild. The journey home from the hospital was a blur of pain medication and fitful dozing for Tom. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through his battered body, a stark reminder of his encounter with the bear. Sarah drove carefully, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing at her husband with worry etched on her face. As they pulled into their driveway in Albany, Tom stirred from his uneasy sleep. the familiar sight of their modest, two-story home brought a wave of emotion he wasn't prepared for. Tears pricked at his eyes as the full weight of what he'd been through and how close he'd come to never seeing this place again hit him. "We're home, honey," Sarah said softly, reaching over to gently squeeze his uninjured hand. Tom nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. With Sarah's help, he slowly made his way into the house, each step a careful negotiation between movement and pain. The next few days were a haze of rest, medication, and visits from concerned friends and family. Tom's daughter, Emma, had taken time off from college to help out, her usual carefree demeanor replaced by a quiet attentiveness that made Tom's heart ache. As the fog of pain medication began to lift, Tom found himself grappling with the psychological aftermath of the attack. Nightmares plagued his sleep, vivid recreations of the bear's charge that left him waking in a cold sweat, his heart racing. One morning, about a week after returning home, Tom sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee. Sarah watched him with concern, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the far-off look in his gaze. "Tom," she said gently, sitting across from him, I think it might be good for you to talk to someone. A professional, I mean." Tom looked up, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his face. "I'm fine, Sarah. I just need some time." Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand. "You're not fine, honey, and that's okay. You've been through something traumatic. There's no shame in getting help." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right," he conceded. The next day, Tom had his first session with Dr. Lydia Chen, a therapist specializing in trauma. As he sat in her cozy office, surrounded by potted plants and calming artwork, Tom found himself opening up about the attack in a way he hadn't been able to with his family. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," Tom admitted, his voice low. "If I'd been more careful with my food storage, if I'd left the area after the first bear sighting." Dr. Chen nodded empathetically. "It's natural to replay the events, to look for ways you could have changed the outcome. But it's important to remember, Tom, that you survived. You did what you needed to do in an incredibly difficult situation." Over the next few weeks, Tom continued his sessions with Dr. Chen, slowly working through the trauma of the attack. At home, he began the long process of physical rehabilitation, pushing through the pain to regain strength and mobility in his injured shoulder. As his body healed, Tom found himself drawn to his fishing gear, which Sarah had cleaned and stored away upon their return from the hospital. One afternoon, he stood in the garage, running his fingers over his favorite rod, lost in thought. Sarah found him there, a wistful expression on his face. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. Tom nodded. "More than I thought I would," he admitted. "It's not just the fishing, you know, it's the peace, the connection with nature." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "Why don't we go to the park tomorrow? There's that little pond. It's not the Adirondacks, but—" Tom turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That sounds nice," he said. The next day, Tom and Sarah set up chairs by the local park's pond. It was a far cry from the wild streams of the Adirondacks, but as Tom cast his line into the still water, he felt a familiar sense of calm wash over him. As the weeks turned into months, Tom's recovery progressed. His physical therapy sessions were grueling, but he attacked them with determination, driven by the goal of regaining as much function as possible in his injured arm. It was during this time that Tom received an unexpected call. Jack Thornton, the editor of a popular fishing magazine, had heard about Tom's story and was interested in featuring it in an upcoming issue. "We want to focus on wilderness safety," Jack explained over the phone. "Your experience could really help educate our readers, Mr. Reynolds." Tom hesitated. The idea of revisiting the attack in such a public way was daunting, but then he thought of other fishermen, hikers and campers who might benefit from hearing his story. "Okay," Tom agreed. "I'll do it." Over the next few weeks, Tom worked with a writer from the magazine, recounting his experience in detail. He spoke candidly about his mistakes, the careless food storage, the decision to continue fishing after the initial bear sighting, and the lessons he'd learned. "I used to think I knew everything about being in the wilderness," Tom told the writer. "But nature has a way of humbling you. Respect and caution are crucial, no matter how experienced you are." As the article came together, Tom found the process unexpectedly therapeutic. Sharing his story, emphasizing the importance of safety measures, felt like a way of reclaiming some control over the narrative of his attack. The day the magazine hit newsstands, Tom sat at his kitchen table, staring at his own face on the cover. The headline read, "Survived to tell the tale. One man's harrowing bear encounter and the lessons learned." Sarah came up behind him, wrapping her arms gently around his shoulders. "How do you feel?" she asked. Tom took a deep breath. "Nervous," he admitted. "But good, I think. If this helps even one person avoid what I went through, it's worth it." In the days that followed, Tom received an outpouring of support. Fellow outdoor enthusiasts reached out to share their own close calls and to thank him for his candor. Park rangers and wildlife officials praised the article for its emphasis on proper safety protocols. One evening, as Tom sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he felt a shift within himself. The fear and trauma of the attack were still there, a part of him now. But alongside them was a new sense of purpose, a desire to use his experience, to help others. Sarah joined him, handing him a steaming mug of tea. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Tom was quiet for a moment, sipping his tea. Then he said, I think I want to go back." Sarah stiffened beside him. "Back to the Adirondacks?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Tom nodded. "Not alone," he quickly assured her, "and not deep into the backcountry. But I need to face it, Sarah. I can't let fear keep me from the places I love." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll do it together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would not be easy. The memories of the attack would always be with him. But he was alive, he was healing, and he was determined to find his way back to the wilderness he loved, older, wiser, and with a newfound respect for the wild beauty and inherent dangers of the natural world. The early morning mist hung low over the lake, creating an ethereal atmosphere as Tom and Sarah unloaded their gear from the car. It had been a year since the bear attack, and this trip to a popular campground in the Adirondacks was Tom's first time back in the wilderness he once considered a second home. Tom took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp mountain air. His heart raced, but not entirely from fear. There was excitement too, a sense of returning to something fundamental in his being. "You okay?" Sarah asked, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Tom nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah, I think so. It's a lot, but I'm glad we're here." They had chosen a well-maintained campsite not far from the ranger station. It was a far cry from Tom's usual remote spots, but it felt like the right step for his first time back. As they set up their tent, Tom found himself constantly scanning the tree line, his body tense and ready to react to any sign of movement. Sarah noticed his vigilance but said nothing, understanding the complex emotions her husband must be feeling. Once their camp was established, Tom retrieved his fishing rod from the car. He held it reverently, running his fingers along the familiar contours. "I think I'm going to try some casting," he said, his voice a mix of determination and apprehension. Sarah nodded encouragingly. "I'll come with you." They made their way to the lakeshore where a small dock extended into the calm waters. Tom stepped onto the weathered planks, feeling them creak slightly under his weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. With practiced movements, albeit slightly stiff from his lingering injuries, Tom began to cast. The line arced gracefully through the air, the lure landing with a soft plop in the water. The familiar rhythm soothed him, and he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. After a while, Tom felt a tug on his line. His heart leapt, not with fear this time, but with the old excitement of a potential catch. He reeled carefully, feeling the fish fight against the line. "I think I've got one," he called to Sarah, who had been watching from the shore. With a final pull, Tom lifted a decent-sized trout from the water. It wasn't as large as some he'd caught in the past, but at that moment, it felt like the most significant catch of his life. Sarah cheered from the bank, her face beaming with pride and joy. "You did it, Tom," As Tom carefully released the fish back into the lake, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Tears pricked at his eyes, a mixture of relief, triumph, and lingering fear. "I did it," he whispered to himself, watching the ripples spread where the fish had disappeared. The rest of the day passed peacefully. Tom and Sarah hiked some of the easier trails near their campsite, Tom constantly vigilant, but gradually relaxing as they encountered nothing more dangerous than a curious chipmunk. As evening approached, they returned to their campsite. Tom insisted on following every safety protocol to the letter, properly storing their food, and ensuring no attractants were left out. "Better safe than sorry," he muttered, double-checking the bear canister. Sarah watched him with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. "You're doing great, honey," she assured him. As they sat by their campfire that night, Tom found himself opening up about his feelings. "It's strange," he began, staring into the flames. "Being back here, a part of me feels so at home, but another part is constantly on edge, waiting for something to go wrong." Sarah reached out, taking his hand. "That's normal, Tom. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's okay to feel conflicted." Tom nodded, squeezing her hand gratefully. "I keep thinking about that bear," he admitted. "Not just the attack, but it was just doing what bears do, you know? I was the one who made mistakes." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the crackling fire and the night sounds of the forest. "I've been thinking," Tom said finally. "Maybe I could do some talks at local schools or outdoor clubs. Share my story. Emphasize the importance of wilderness safety." Sarah smiled warmly. "I think that's a wonderful idea." As they prepared for bed, Tom took one last look around their campsite, ensuring everything was secure. The familiar routine brought comfort, a sense of control in an environment that had once betrayed him. Inside the tent, as they settled into their sleeping bags, Sarah turned to Tom. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "Coming back here, facing your fears, it takes real courage." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. As they drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the forest surrounded them, the gentle lapping of the lake, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl. For the first time in a long while, Tom felt at peace in the wilderness. The next morning, they awoke to a beautiful sunrise over the lake. Tom emerged from the tent, stretching carefully, mindful of his still healing injuries. He paused, taking in the scene before him, the mist rising off the water, the early morning light painting the trees in golden hues. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, coming to stand beside him. Tom nodded, a sense of contentment washing over him. "It really is." As they prepared breakfast, a park ranger stopped by their campsite. Tom tensed initially, memories of his post-attack interview flashing through his mind. "Good morning, folks," the ranger greeted them cheerfully. "Just doing my rounds. Everything okay here?" Tom relaxed, offering a smile. "Everything's great, thanks." The ranger nodded approvingly as he glanced around their well-maintained campsite. "Glad to hear it. You folks seem to know what you're doing. Always good to see responsible campers." The ranger turned to leave. Tom called out, "Actually, I was wondering if I could ask you something." The ranger paused, turning back. "Sure thing." Tom took a deep breath. "I was thinking about doing some talks on wilderness safety, sharing my experience. Do you think the Park Service might be interested in something like that?" The ranger's eyes lit up. "Absolutely. We're always looking for ways to educate visitors about safety. Why don't you stop by the station later? We can chat more about it." As the ranger departed, Sarah beamed at Tom. "Look at you," she said proudly, "turning your experience into something positive." Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time since the attack, he felt truly hopeful about his relationship with the wilderness. It would never be the same as before. He was forever changed by his encounter with the bear. But perhaps he realized that change didn't have to be entirely negative. As they finished their breakfast and prepared for a day of gentle hiking, Tom found himself looking forward to the future. He might not ever return to solo backpacking in remote areas, but he could still find joy in nature. More than that, he could help others do the same, safely and responsibly. "Ready for our hike?" Sarah asked, shouldering her small day pack. Tom nodded, taking one last look around their campsite. Ready, he replied, and he meant it. Ready for the hike, ready for the talk with the rangers, ready for whatever new adventure life had in store for him. As they set off down the trail, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. The forest, once a source of terror, was slowly becoming a place of healing. With each step, each breath of mountain air, he was reclaiming a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever. The bear attack had changed him, there was no denying that. But standing there in the Adirondacks, with Sarah by his side and a newfound purpose in his heart, Tom realized that change had also opened up new possibilities. He was no longer just a survivor. He was an advocate, an educator, a steward of the wilderness he loved. And that, he decided, was a pretty good place to be. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink as Tom's truck rumbled down the winding mountain road. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as the events of the day replayed in his mind. The bear attack, the desperate struggle in the stream, the agonizing trek back to his vehicle, it all seemed surreal now, like a nightmare he couldn't quite shake. As he approached the small town nestled at the base of the Adirondacks, Tom's vision began to blur. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, replaced by waves of pain and exhaustion. He blinked hard, trying to focus on the road ahead. Just a little further, he muttered to himself, gritting his teeth against the throbbing in his shoulder. The lights of the town came into view, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Tom's eyes locked onto the illuminated sign of the local hospital, and he felt a surge of relief. He was almost there. Pulling into the hospital parking lot, Tom's last reserves of strength were rapidly depleting. He fumbled with the door handle, his injured arm hanging uselessly at his side. As he stumbled out of the truck, the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. "Help!" he called out weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, someone help!" A nurse, stepping out for a break, spotted Tom and immediately rushed to his side. "Sir? Sir? Are you all right?" Tom tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His legs buckled beneath him, and he felt himself falling. The last thing he saw before darkness overtook him was the nurse's concerned face as she called for assistance. When Tom regained consciousness, he found himself in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the air. A doctor stood at his bedside reviewing a chart. "Mr. Reynolds?" the doctor said, noticing Tom's open eyes. "I'm Dr. Patel. You're in Adirondack Medical Center. Do you remember what happened?" Tom nodded weakly, wincing at the movement. "Bear attack," he managed to croak out. Dr. Patel's expression grew serious. "Yes, and you've sustained some significant injuries. We've treated the wounds on your shoulder, arm, and back, but you've lost a lot of blood. We're going to need to keep you here for observation and further treatment." As the doctor explained the extent of his injuries and the treatment plan, Tom's mind drifted. He thought of Sarah and Emma, his wife and daughter back home in Albany. They must be worried sick. "My family," Tom interrupted. "Has anyone contacted them?" Dr. Patel nodded reassuringly. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds. Your wife has been notified and is on her way here now." Relief washed over Tom, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. Sarah had always worried about his solo fishing trips. How many times had she asked him to be more careful, to take someone along? And now her worst fears had come true. The next few hours passed in a blur of tests, medications, and fitful sleep. Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with flashing teeth and gleaming claws. He was roused from one such uneasy slumber by a familiar voice. "Tom?" "Oh, thank God." Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry. She rushed to his bedside, carefully taking his hand in hers. "Sarah," Tom croaked, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, I should have listened to you." "Shh," she soothed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We can talk about that later. I'm just glad you're alive." As Sarah settled into the chair beside his bed, a park ranger entered the room. He introduced himself as Ranger Mike Johnson. "Mr. Reynolds," the ranger began, "I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you some questions about the attack. It's important we have all the details to ensure the safety of other visitors to the area." Tom nodded weakly and, with Sarah's encouragement, began to recount his harrowing experience. He described the initial sighting of the bear, his attempts to scare it off, and the terrifying moment when it charged. Ranger Johnson listened intently, jotting notes in a small pad. When Tom finished his account, the ranger's brow furrowed. "You said you used bear spray," he asked, "and it didn't deter the bear." Tom shook his head. "It seemed to work for a moment, but then it just got angrier." The ranger made another note. "That's concerning. A properly used bear spray is usually very effective. We'll need to investigate further." As the ranger prepared to leave, he paused. "Mr. Reynolds, I have to ask, did you follow proper food storage protocols at your campsite?" Tom felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. I got careless," he admitted. "After a good day of fishing, I didn't clean up as thoroughly as I should have." Ranger Johnson's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I understand the excitement of a successful trip, but it's crucial to always follow safety guidelines. Bears that associate humans with food can become dangerous repeat offenders." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. Tom realized that his carelessness might have consequences beyond his own injuries. After the ranger left, Sarah turned to Tom, her eyes brimming with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you won't go out there alone again." Tom squeezed her hand gently. "I promise," he replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. As the days passed, Tom's condition slowly improved. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery, but warned that he had a long road ahead. Physical therapy would be necessary to regain full use of his arm, and the psychological impact of the attack was yet to be fully understood. One afternoon, as Tom sat in his hospital bed, gazing out the window at the distant mountains, a local news reporter stopped by his room. She asked if he'd be willing to share his story. Tom hesitated. Part of him wanted to put the whole ordeal behind him, to forget it had ever happened, but another part recognized the importance of raising awareness about bear safety. "All right," he agreed finally. "If it might help prevent someone else from going through this, I'll talk." The interview was brief but impactful. Tom spoke candidly about his experience, emphasizing the importance of following proper safety protocols in bear country. He also touched on the complex emotions he was dealing with, the fear, but also the continued respect for the wild beauty of the Adirondacks. As the reporter left, Tom felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. Telling his story had been difficult, but it also felt like a small step towards reclaiming his narrative, towards finding meaning in his traumatic experience. Sarah, who had been silent during the interview, took Tom's hand. "You did good," she said softly. "Your story might save lives." Tom nodded, his gaze drifting back to the window, to the mountains beyond. He knew his relationship with the wilderness had been forever altered. The carefree solo trips of his past were likely over. But as he looked out at the rugged landscape, he felt a flicker of something unexpected, a desire to return, to face his fears, to find a new way to connect with the natural world he loved. "We'll go back someday," he said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. "Together, when I'm healed, we'll go back." Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding the weight of his words. "Together," she agreed. As the sun began to set, painting the distant peaks in gold and crimson, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road to recovery would be long and challenging, but he was alive, he had survived. And somehow, someway, he would find his way back to the wilderness, changed but undefeated. The fluorescent lights of the local police station hummed softly as Tom sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his bandaged shoulder throbbing dully. It had been 3 days since his discharge from the hospital, and now he found himself recounting his harrowing experience once again, this time to a skeptical-looking detective. "So, Mr. Reynolds," Detective Lisa Hawkins began, her pen poised over a notepad, "walk me through the events one more time, if you would." Tom sighed, running his good hand through his hair. "Like I said, I was fishing in my usual spot when I saw the bear. I tried to scare it off, but it charged. We ended up in the stream and, well, you can see the result." He gestured to his injured arm. Detective Hawkins nodded, her expression neutral. "And you're certain it was a black bear? Not a grizzly?" "Yes, I'm sure," Tom replied, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "I've been fishing those waters for years. I know the difference." The detective made a note, then looked up at Tom with a penetrating gaze. "Mr. Reynolds, I have to ask, were you drinking that day?" Tom felt a flash of anger. "What? No, I never drink when I'm out there. It's too dangerous." "I see," Detective Hawkins said, her tone non-committal. "It's just that bear attacks of this nature are extremely rare, especially with black bears, and without any physical evidence beyond your injuries." Tom leaned forward, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Look, I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, it happened exactly as I said. Why would I make this up?" The detective shrugged. "People seek attention for all sorts of reasons, Mr. Reynolds. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but we have to consider all possibilities." Tom slumped back in his chair, feeling a mix of frustration and despair. He'd known this might happen, that some would doubt his story. But facing that doubt head-on was more difficult than he'd anticipated. "Is there anything else you can tell?" "Thus," Detective Hawkins pressed, "any details you might have forgotten before?" Tom closed his eyes, trying to recall every moment of the terrifying encounter. I remember the bear's eyes," he said softly. "They weren't angry or vicious. Just curious, maybe. Hungry. It was just doing what bears do." The detective's expression softened slightly. "That's actually a common observation from survivors of animal attacks. They often report a sense of the animal's otherness, I suppose you could say." Tom nodded, feeling a small sense of relief at being believed, even if just for this detail. As the interview wound down, Detective Hawkins closed her notepad. "We'll file your report, Mr. Reynolds, but I have to be honest. Without physical evidence or witnesses, there's not much we can do beyond that. We'll notify the park services." "Of course, but that's it," Tom finished for her, resignation in his voice. "I'm afraid so," the detective confirmed. "I'm sorry you went through this experience, Mr. Reynolds. I hope you're able to find some peace." As Tom left the police station, he felt a weight settling on his shoulders that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. The doubt he'd faced, the implication that he might be lying or exaggerating, cut deep. He'd known his story would be hard for some to believe, but he hadn't been prepared for how much it would hurt to have his traumatic experience questioned. Sarah was waiting for him in the car, her face a mask of concern. "How did it go?" she asked as he eased himself into the passenger seat. Tom shook his head. "About as well as you'd expect. They'll file the report, but I don't think they really believe me." Sarah reached over, squeezing his hand. "I believe you, Tom. That's what matters." As they drove home, Tom found himself lost in thought. The detective's skepticism had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He'd always prided himself on his honesty, on being a straight shooter. The idea that people might view him as an attention seeker or a liar was deeply unsettling. That evening, as Tom sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he heard the familiar ping of an email notification on his phone. Opening it, he saw it was from Jack Thornton, the editor of the fishing magazine that had published his story. "Hey Tom," the email read, "hope you're healing up well. I wanted to give you a heads up. We've been getting some pushback on your article. A few readers are questioning the authenticity of your account. I stand by our decision to publish, but I thought you should know. Let me know if you want to respond in any way. Jack." Tom felt his heart sink. He'd hoped that sharing his story might help others, might serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of wilderness safety. Instead, it seemed to be inviting more doubt and scrutiny. Sarah found him there an hour later, still staring at his phone. "Tom, what's wrong?" He handed her the phone wordlessly, watching as she read the email. Her face clouded with anger. "This is ridiculous," she fumed. "You nearly died, and now people are calling you a liar." Tom shrugged, feeling suddenly very tired. "Can you blame them? It does sound pretty incredible when you think about it. A man survives a bear attack with no witnesses, no evidence beyond his own injuries. But it happened," Sarah insisted. "I saw what that bear did to you. The doctors saw it. The rangers saw where it happened." "But no one saw the actual attack," Tom said softly. "And that's what matters, I guess." They sat in silence for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. Finally, Sarah spoke. "So what do you want to do?" Tom considered the question. Part of him wanted to fight back, to defend his story and his integrity. But another part, a larger part, just wanted to put the whole ordeal behind him. "Nothing," he said at last. "I'm not going to try to convince people who don't want to be convinced. I know what happened, you know what happened, that's enough." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And the next time someone asks about your scars," Tom managed a small smile, "I'll tell them the truth. Whether they believe it or not is up to them." As they headed inside for the night, Tom paused at the door, looking back at the darkened yard. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of the Adirondacks, the bear that had attacked him was going about its life, unaware of the turmoil it had caused in Tom's. In a strange way, Tom envied the animal's simplicity of existence. He knew the doubts would linger, both in others and on his darkest days in himself. The lack of concrete evidence beyond his scars meant that his story would always be questioned by some. But as he closed the door behind him, Tom made a silent vow. To himself, he would not let those doubts define him. He had survived, he had learned, and he would carry those lessons with him always, believed or not. The early morning mist hung low over the familiar stream, creating an ethereal atmosphere as Tom stood on the bank, fly rod in hand. It had been exactly 1 year since the bear attack, and despite his family's objections, he had felt compelled to return to this spot. The Adirondacks called to him, a siren song he couldn't ignore, even as the memory of gnashing teeth and searing pain lingered in his mind. Sarah stood a few paces behind him, worry etched on her face. "Are you sure about this, Tom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the gently flowing water. "I need to do this, Sarah. I can't let fear control me forever." He took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp mountain air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, bringing back a flood of memories, both good and bad. His shoulder, though healed, ached with phantom pain as he readied his cast. With practiced ease, Tom sent his line arcing through the air. The fly landed softly on the water's surface, creating a small ripple. As he began to work the line, he felt a familiar sense of peace wash over him. This was where he belonged. "It's beautiful," Sarah murmured, moving to stand beside him. Tom smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his body. "It really is. I'd almost forgotten." They stood in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle gurgle of the stream and the occasional splash of a jumping fish. Tom lost himself in the rhythm of casting, retrieving, and casting again. For a moment, it was as if the attack had never happened. But then a rustle in the nearby bushes shattered the illusion. Tom's body tensed instantly, his heart rate spiking. Sarah's hand found his, squeezing gently. "It's okay," she soothed. "Probably just a squirrel." Tom nodded, trying to calm his racing pulse. "Yeah, you're right, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine, not really. The bear attack had left more than just physical scars. Every unexpected sound, every shadow at the edge of his vision sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. The wilderness he had once navigated with confident ease now felt filled with hidden dangers. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Tom's casts became less frequent. He found himself spending more time scanning the tree line, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Sarah noticed his growing unease. "Maybe we should head back to the campsite," she suggested gently. Tom shook his head, a hint of stubbornness in his voice. "Not yet. I'm not ready to give up." Just then he felt a tug on his line. His instincts kicked in, and he began to work the fish with skill born from years of experience. For a few exhilarating moments, the world narrowed to just him and the unseen trout fighting on the other end of the line. With a final expert pull, Tom brought the fish to the surface. It was a beautiful rainbow trout, not as large as some he'd caught in the past, but a respectable size nonetheless. As he carefully removed the hook, a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen since they'd arrived. "Nice catch," Sarah said, her own relief evident in her voice. Tom nodded, gently releasing the trout back into the stream. "Thanks." For a moment there, it felt just like old times. As they watched the fish swim away, a park ranger approached them from further down the bank. Tom tensed again, memories of skeptical police interviews flashing through his mind. "Morning, folks," the ranger called out cheerfully. "Doing some fishing?" Tom nodded, forcing a smile. Yes, sir. Just caught and released a nice rainbow. The ranger's eyes lit up with interest. Is that so? You must be pretty skilled. I'm Ranger Mike, by the way. As they shook hands, the ranger's gaze fell on Tom's scarred forearm, visible where he'd rolled up his sleeve. His expression changed, a mix of recognition and concern crossing his face. Wait a minute, Ranger Mike said slowly. Are you Tom Reynolds? The guy who survived that bear attack last year? Tom felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. Here it came, the doubt, the questioning, the subtle implications that he might be exaggerating or lying outright. He'd faced it so many times over. The past year that he'd developed a thick skin, but it still stung. That's me, he confirmed, his voice flat. To his surprise, the ranger's face broke into a wide grin. Mr. Reynolds, it's an honor to meet you. Your story has become required reading for all our new rangers. The way you handled yourself in that situation, it's incredible. Tom blinked, taken aback by the enthusiastic response. Thank you. I'm just glad I survived. Ranger Mike nodded seriously. And we're glad you did too. Your experience has helped us improve our safety protocols and visitor education programs. In fact, we've seen a significant decrease in careless food storage since your story went public. As the ranger continued to talk, expressing his admiration and asking thoughtful questions about the encounter, Tom felt something shift inside him. For the first time since the attack, he felt truly validated. Here was someone who not only believed him, but saw value in his experience. Sarah, sensing the change in Tom's demeanor, gently squeezed his hand. He returned the pressure, grateful for her constant support. As Ranger Mike prepared to continue his rounds, he paused. Mr. Reynolds, I know this might be a lot to ask, but we're always looking for experienced outdoorsmen to help with our wilderness safety programs. If you'd ever be interested in sharing your story directly with visitors, I think it could make a real difference. Tom was quiet for a moment, considering the offer. The idea of reliving his traumatic experience was daunting, but the thought of potentially helping others avoid a similar fate was appealing. I'll think about it, he said finally. Thank you for the offer. As the ranger walked away, Sarah turned to Tom. What do you think? Would you want to do something like that? Tom gazed out over the stream, watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface. Maybe, he said softly. It might be a way to make something good come out of all this. They stood there for a while longer, Tom occasionally casting his line, but mostly just soaking in the beauty of the Adirondacks. The forest that had once been a source of terror was slowly becoming a place of healing. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Tom reeled in his line for the last time. I think I'm ready to head back now, he said. Sarah nodded, relief evident in her eyes. How do you feel? Tom was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Honestly, better than I have in a long time. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe out here again, but it's still beautiful, still worth it. As they walked back towards their campsite, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. The bear attack had changed him, there was no denying that. But standing there in the Adirondacks, with Sarah by his side and a newfound purpose in his heart, he realized that change had also opened up new possibilities. He was no longer just a survivor. He was an advocate, an educator, a steward of the wilderness he loved. And that, he decided, was a pretty good place to be. The bear that had attacked him was out there somewhere, continuing its wild existence. But as Tom looked back at the stream one last time, he felt no fear, only a deep respect for the untamed beauty of nature, and a renewed determination to help others experience it safely. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Mark Thompson pulled into the parking lot at the Alum Cave Trail trailhead, his blue sedan kicking up a small cloud of dust as it came to a stop. He sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. The early morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of oak and maple trees, casting dappled shadows across the windshield. You've got this, Mark, he muttered to himself, finally releasing his grip and reaching for the door handle. As he stepped out of the car, the crisp mountain air filled his lungs, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. It was a welcome change from the stale office air he'd been breathing all week. At 32, Mark was no stranger to hiking, but it had been a while since he'd tackled a trail alone. His job as an accountant in Knoxville had been particularly demanding. Lately, with long hours spent poring over spreadsheets and financial reports, this solo trip was meant to be a reset, a chance to clear his head and reconnect with nature. He made his way to the back of the car and popped the trunk, revealing his meticulously packed hiking gear. As he shouldered his backpack, a nearby car had slammed, startling him. An older couple emerged from a weathered pickup truck, their easy smiles and well-worn hiking boots marking them as experienced trail-goers. "Morning," the man called out, giving Mark a friendly nod. "Heading up Alum Cave?" Mark nodded, adjusting the straps on his pack. "Yeah, thought I'd give it a shot. You folks familiar with the trail?" The woman chuckled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Oh, we've been coming here for years. It's a beautiful hike, but make sure you're prepared. Weather can change quick up there." "Thanks for the tip," Mark replied, patting the side pocket of his backpack. "I've got extra layers and plenty of water. Should be good to go." As the couple headed towards the trailhead, Mark did a final equipment check. Water bottles, check. Trail mix and energy bars, check. First aid kit, check. He hesitated for a moment before reaching back into the car and grabbing the can of Bear spray he'd purchased on a whim at the outdoor store last week. "Better safe than sorry," he muttered, clipping the spray to his belt. The weight of it felt reassuring against his hip, even if he doubted he'd need to use it. With everything secured, Mark made his way to the trailhead. A large wooden sign greeted him, detailing the route and highlighting points of interest along the way. His eyes skimmed over the information, lingering on the wildlife warning at the bottom. "Black bears active in this area. Use caution and store food properly." A mix of excitement and apprehension fluttered in his stomach. This was why he'd come, after all, to challenge himself, to feel that rush of adrenaline that came with exploring the wilderness. Yet a small voice in the back of his mind whispered caution, reminding him of the inherent risks of solo hiking. As he took his first steps onto the trail, the sounds of the parking lot faded away, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a woodpecker. The path started off relatively easy, winding through stands of rhododendron and mountain laurel. Mark found himself relaxing into the rhythm of the hike, his boots crunching softly on the mix of dirt and fallen leaves. About a half-mile in, he paused at a small clearing, taking in the view of the surrounding mountains. The morning mist was just beginning to lift, revealing the lush green valleys below. Mark pulled out his phone, snapping a quick photo to share with his colleagues back in Knoxville. As he put the phone away, a movement in the underbrush caught his eye. He froze, heart rate quickening as he scanned the area. After a tense moment, a chipmunk darted out from beneath a fallen log, chattering indignantly at being disturbed. Mark let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head at his own jumpiness. "Get it together, Thompson," he chided himself. "It's just nature doing its thing." Continuing on, the trail began to steepen, requiring more of Mark's focus and energy. He found himself grateful for the extra time he'd been putting in at the gym lately, as his legs powered him up the incline. The forest around him seemed to press in closer, the trees growing taller and more densely packed. As he rounded a bend, Mark came face to face with another hiker heading in the opposite direction. The man, probably in his mid-40s and sporting a salt and pepper beard, gave him a quick once-over. "Hiking alone?" he asked, a note of concern in his voice. Mark nodded, suddenly feeling a bit defensive. "Yeah, just needed to get away for a bit. Clear my head, you know." The man's expression softened. "I get it. Just be careful up ahead. I saw some fresh bear scat about a mile up the trail. Might want to make some noise as you go. Let them know you're coming." A jolt of anxiety shot through Mark at the mention of bears, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Thanks for the heads up. I've got some bear spray just in case." "Good man," the other hiker replied, clapping Mark on the shoulder as he passed. "Enjoy the hike and stay safe out there." As the sound of the other hiker's footsteps faded away, Mark found himself alone once again. The forest seemed different now, less welcoming and more watchful. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig set his nerves on edge. He pressed on, trying to focus on the beauty around him rather than the potential dangers. The trail led him past towering old-growth trees, their massive trunks testament to centuries of survival in these mountains. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating patches of delicate wildflowers that dotted the forest floor. As he hiked, Mark began to hum softly, then sing under his breath, remembering the advice to make noise. His off-key rendition of Born to Run echoed slightly in the quiet forest, providing a strange comfort as he pushed further up the trail. After about an hour of steady climbing, Mark reached a small stream cutting across the path. The sound of rushing water filled the air, drowning out the ambient forest noise. He paused, taking the opportunity to refill his water bottle and splash some cool water on his face. As he knelt by the stream, a flicker of movement on the opposite bank caught his attention. His breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with a young deer, its ears twitching nervously. For a long moment they stared at each other, two beings sharing a fleeting connection in the vastness of the wilderness, the spell was broken by a distant rumble of thunder. Mark glanced up, noticing for the first time the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The deer, startled by the sound, bounded away into the underbrush. Standing up, Mark checked his watch and considered his options. He was making good time, but the approaching storm gave him pause. Safety warred with determination in his mind as he weighed the risks of continuing versus turning back. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he shouldered his pack and turned to face the upward slope of the trail. "A little rain never hurt anyone," he said aloud as if to convince himself. "Besides, I didn't come all this way to turn back now." With renewed determination, Mark set off once more, unaware that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. As he disappeared around the next bend, the forest seemed to close in behind him, hiding his passage and keeping its secrets. As Mark ventured deeper into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the world around him transformed. The well-maintained trail near the parking lot gave way to a more rugged path winding through increasingly dense vegetation. The canopy overhead thickened, filtering the sunlight into a green-tinged glow that danced across the forest floor. The sounds of civilization had long since faded, replaced by a symphony of nature. Birdsong echoed through the trees, accompanied by the rustling of leaves in the gentle mountain breeze. Occasionally, a woodpecker's rapid-fire tapping would punctuate the air, startling Mark from his thoughts. As he hiked, Mark found his mind wandering, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on, the trail acting as a metronome for his thoughts. The stress of his job in Knoxville seemed to melt away with each step, replaced by a growing sense of peace and connection to his surroundings. "This is exactly what I needed," he murmured to himself, pausing to take a sip of water. The cool liquid was refreshing after the steady climb, and he took a moment to catch his breath and survey his surroundings. The trail ahead snaked upwards, disappearing around a bend. To his right, the mountain fell away sharply, offering glimpses of the vast expanse of the national park through gaps in the trees. Mist clung to distant peaks, softening their edges and lending an air of mystery to the landscape. Mark pulled out his phone, framing a shot of the view. As he snapped the photo, a pang of regret hit him. "Wish you could see this, Dad," he said softly, thinking of his late father who had first introduced him to hiking as a child. Those early trips had instilled in Mark a love for nature that had sadly taken a back seat to his career in recent years. Putting his phone away, Mark pressed on. The trail grew steeper, challenging his fitness and forcing him to focus on his footing. Gnarled roots and loose rocks became more frequent obstacles, requiring careful navigation. After about an hour of steady climbing, Mark rounded a bend and found himself facing a small clearing. Sunlight streamed down, illuminating a patch of wildflowers in a riot of colors. Purple coneflowers nodded in the breeze, alongside bright orange butterfly weed and delicate white bloodroot. "Wow," Mark breathed, taking in the scene. He stepped off the trail, careful not to trample any of the flowers, and made his way to a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. Settling down, he pulled out his trail mix and decided to take a short break. As he munched on a handful of nuts and dried fruit, movement at the far edge of the clearing caught his eye. A red fox emerged from the underbrush, its russet coat gleaming in the sunlight. The animal paused, nose twitching as it scented the air. Mark held his breath, not wanting to startle the creature. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the clearing. Then, with a flick of its bushy tail, the fox melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. "Thanks for the show," Mark called after it, grinning. The brief encounter left him feeling invigorated, a reminder of why he'd chosen to make this solo trip. Checking his watch, Mark realized he'd been hiking for several hours. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, its warmth more noticeable now even under the tree cover. He stood stretching out muscles that had begun to stiffen during his rest. As he prepared to continue his hike, a low rumble of thunder in the distance gave him pause. Looking up, he could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, partially obscured by the mountaintops. "Looks like those folks at the trailhead were right about the weather," Mark muttered, frowning. He weighed his options. Turning back now would mean several hours of hiking to reach his car, likely in the rain. Pressing on might lead him to some form of shelter, but it also meant heading further from civilization if the weather turned truly nasty. After a moment's hesitation, Mark decided to continue. "I've come this far," he reasoned aloud. "Might as well see it through." He made a mental note to keep an eye out for any structures or overhangs that could provide shelter if needed. The trail beyond the clearing narrowed, hemmed in by thick rhododendron bushes on both sides. Their waxy leaves brushed against Mark's arms as he passed, leaving behind droplets of moisture from the morning's dew. As he hiked, the air grew heavier, the promise of rain hanging over the forest. The birdsong that had been his constant companion began to taper off, replaced by an expectant hush. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath, leaves hanging still in the oppressive air. Mark quickened his pace, driven by a growing sense of urgency. The beauty of his surroundings took on a more ominous cast as the light dimmed, shadows deepening among the trees. Rounding a sharp bend in the trail, Mark came to an abrupt halt. There, not 20 feet ahead, was a massive old-growth oak tree that had fallen across the path. Its huge trunk, easily 5 feet in diameter, created a formidable obstacle. "Well, this complicates things," Mark said, approaching the fallen giant cautiously. He examined the tree, looking for a way around or over. The surrounding vegetation was too thick to easily bypass the obstacle, and the trunk itself was slick with moss, making climbing over a risky proposition. As he stood contemplating, his next move, a fat raindrop landed on his cheek. Within moments, more followed, pattering against the leaves overhead. The storm had arrived. Mark quickly shrugged off his backpack and pulled out his rain jacket, zipping it up just as the skies opened in earnest. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the forest canopy and quickly saturating the ground. Seeking what little shelter he could find, Mark ducked under the sprawling roots of the fallen oak. The massive root ball, upended when the tree fell, created a small overhang that offered some protection from the deluge. As he huddled there, watching, the rain turned the trail into a muddy stream. Mark couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of his situation. Some relaxing hike this turned out to be, he chuckled, shaking his head. The storm raged on, lightning flashing in the distance, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very mountain. Mark found himself grateful for the solid presence of the oak at his back, even as he worried about the possibility of more trees coming down in the wind. As suddenly as it had begun, the downpour slackened, fading to a gentle drizzle. The forest around Mark dripped and glistened, the rain having washed everything clean. A tentative birdsong started up again, as if testing whether it was safe to resume normal operations. Mark emerged from his makeshift shelter, stretching out, stiff muscles. The trail ahead looked treacherous, mud and wet leaves promising a slippery journey. But the air felt fresher, cleaner somehow, and despite his damp clothes, Mark felt a renewed sense of excitement for what lay ahead. He carefully picked his way over the fallen oak, using exposed roots as handholds. On the other side, he paused to get his bearings. The rain had washed away some of the trail markers, but the path itself was still discernible, winding up the mountainside. As Mark prepared to continue his journey, a break in the clouds allowed a shaft of sunlight to pierce the canopy. It illuminated a section of the trail ahead, steam rising from the damp earth in ethereal wisps. "Now that's a sight worth hiking for," Mark said softly, drinking in the scene. He pulled out his phone to capture the moment, then tucked it away safely, mindful of the lingering moisture in the air. With a deep breath of the rain-cleansed air, Mark set off once more. The challenges he'd faced, the fallen tree, the sudden storm, had only served to deepen his appreciation for the wilderness around him. As he hiked on, alert for any signs of wildlife returning after the rain, Mark felt a profound sense of connection to the ancient forest. Little did he know that this feeling of harmony with nature was about to be shattered in the most primal and terrifying way possible. The true test of his resilience and will to survive lay just around the bend, waiting in the form of an encounter that would forever change his perception of the wild. The forest had taken on a different character. In the wake of the storm, droplets clung to every leaf and branch, catching the light and transforming the woods into a glittering wonderland. Mark's boots squelched in the mud as he carefully picked his way along the trail, alert for any treacherous patches that might send him sliding. As he rounded a bend, the sound of rushing water reached his ears. The trail dipped slightly, leading him towards a bubbling stream swollen with rainwater. Mark paused at the water's edge, watching the clear mountain stream tumble over moss-covered rocks. "Perfect spot for a breather," he murmured to himself, shrugging off his backpack. He'd been hiking for hours now, and the combination of the steep terrain and unexpected weather had taken its toll. Mark found a relatively dry boulder near the stream and settled down, pulling out his water bottle and a granola bar. As he sat there, letting the gentle sound of the stream wash over him, Mark's eyes scanned his surroundings. The area around the stream was more open than the dense forest he'd been traversing, with a small clearing on the opposite bank. It was then that something caught his attention, making his heart skip a beat. There, not 20 feet away on the other side of the stream, was a pile of dark tubular droppings. Even from this distance, Mark could see that they were sizable and fairly fresh. "Bear scat," he whispered, his mouth suddenly dry. The warning from the hiker he'd met earlier echoed in his mind. Mark's hand instinctively went to the bear spray canister on his belt, reassuring himself of its presence. A twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush beyond the clearing, and Mark froze. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. The forest had gone eerily quiet, the usual birdsong conspicuously absent. Slowly, carefully, Mark got to his feet. His mind raced, trying to remember everything he'd ever learned about bear encounters. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself. "Make yourself look big. Don't run." Another snap, closer this time. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly backed, away from the stream, keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line across the water. He debated calling out to make his presence known, but feared attracting unwanted attention. As he reached for his backpack, movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A large dark shape emerged from the shadows of the forest. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he found himself face to face with a black bear. The bear was massive, its shoulders easily reaching Mark's chest height. Its fur was a deep, glossy black, still damp from the recent rain. The animal's nose twitched as it scented the air, small eyes focusing intently on Mark. For a long moment, neither moved. Mark stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of fear and awe. The bear, for its part, seemed more curious than aggressive, tilting its head slightly as it regarded the human intruder. "Hey there, big guy," Mark said softly, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm just passing through, no need for trouble." The bear huffed, taking a step forward. Mark's hand tightened on the bear spray, his thumb flicking off the safety catch. He began to slowly back away, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. "That's right, I'm leaving. This is your territory, I get it," Mark continued, hoping. The sound of his voice might deter the bear from approaching further, but the bear seemed undeterred. It ambled forward, crossing the stream with ease, water cascading off its powerful form. As it reached Mark's side of the bank, it rose up on its hind legs, towering over him. Mark's heart felt like it might burst from his chest. He raised his arms, trying to make himself appear larger. "Back off!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The bear dropped back to all fours, but instead of retreating, it took another step towards Mark. Its nostrils flared, and Mark realized with horror that it could probably smell the granola bar he'd been eating. In that moment, all of Mark's carefully remembered bear safety tips fled his mind. Panic took over, and he did the one thing he knew he shouldn't. He turned and ran. The sound of crashing undergrowth behind him told Mark the bear was in pursuit. He sprinted down the trail, heedless of the slippery mud and protruding roots. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, pure adrenaline driving him forward. "Help!" he screamed, though he knew there was likely no one within earshot. "Somebody help!" The trail took a sharp turn, and Mark's foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves. He went down hard, sprawling face first in the mud. Scrambling to turn over, he saw the bear lumbering towards him, covering ground with terrifying speed. With shaking hands, Mark finally managed to unclip the bear spray from his belt. As the bear closed in, he aimed and pressed down hard on the trigger. A cloud of orangey-red mist erupted from the canister, catching the bear full in the face. The effect was immediate. The animal reared back, pawing at its eyes and snout, letting out a roar of pain and confusion. Mark didn't wait to see what would happen next. He scrambled to his feet and took off down the trail once more, not daring to look back. He ran until his legs felt like jelly and his chest was on fire, the bear's roars fading into the distance behind him. Finally, when he could run no more, Mark collapsed against a tree, sliding down to sit at its base. His whole body shook with exhaustion and residual fear. He sat there for long minutes, straining his ears for any sign of pursuit, but heard only the gradual return of normal forest sounds. As his breathing slowly returned to normal, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Mark examined himself, noting the scrapes on his palms from his fall and the numerous scratches on his arms from crashing through the underbrush. His clothes were caked in mud, and he'd lost his backpack somewhere along the way. "I'm alive," he whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "I can't believe I'm alive." The encounter had lasted only minutes, but to Mark, it felt like hours had passed. He knew he should move, find help, but the adrenaline crash left him feeling weak and disoriented. As he sat there trying to gather the strength to stand, a disturbing thought occurred to him. He had no idea where on the trail he was. In his panic, he'd run blindly, paying no attention to his surroundings or direction. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through him. "Okay, Thompson, think," he said aloud, forcing himself to focus. "The trail has to be nearby. Find the trail. Follow it downhill. You can do this." With a groan, Mark pulled himself to his feet, using the tree for support. His legs felt like lead and every muscle in his body protested the movement. But the thought of being lost in the woods as night approached, possibly with an angry bear still in the area, spurred him on. He began to move slowly through the forest, eyes scanning for any sign of the trail. The terrain all looked the same. Endless trees, fallen logs, and dense undergrowth. Panic began to creep in again as minutes passed with no sign of the path. Just as he was about to give up hope, Mark spotted a flash of color through the trees. Moving closer, he saw it was a trail marker, its bright paint a beacon of hope in the green gloom of the forest. Relief washed over him as he stumbled onto the trail. "Thank God," he breathed, orienting himself to head downhill. As Mark began the long, painful journey back towards civilization, the forest around him settled into the quiet rhythms of early evening. Somewhere in the distance, a bear lumbered away, shaking its head to clear the last lingering effects of the spray. And deep in the woods, a discarded backpack lay as silent testimony to a hiker's brush with the wild heart of the mountains. Mark's legs trembled with each step as he made his way down the trail, his body still reeling from the adrenaline crash. Following his encounter with the black bear, the forest around him had taken on an ominous quality, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting his nerves on edge. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him with grasping fingers. "Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from shouting. "One foot in front of the other, you've got this." But as he rounded a bend in the trail, Mark's progress came to an abrupt halt. There, not 20 yards ahead, stood the black bear. It was facing away from him, its massive form blocking the path entirely. Mark's breath caught in his throat, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray at his hip, only to find an empty clip where the canister had been. Time seemed to stand still as Mark's mind raced through his options. He could try to backtrack, but in his exhausted state he doubted he could outrun the bear if it gave chase. Climbing a tree was out of the question. Black bears were excellent climbers, Making noise might scare it off, but it could also provoke an attack. Before Mark could decide on a course of action, the bear turned its head, catching sight of him. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Mark saw something in the animal's gaze that chilled him to his core: recognition. The bear let out a low growl, turning its body to face Mark fully. Without the bear spray, Mark felt utterly defenseless. His hands shook as he slowly raised them, trying to appear larger. "Easy there, big guy," he said, his voice trembling. "Remember me? I'm the one who gave you that nasty spray to the face. How about we call it even and go our separate ways?" The bear's only response was another growl, deeper this time. It took a step forward, its massive paws leaving imprints in the soft earth of the trail. Mark's survival instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew that would only trigger the bear's predatory response. Instead, he began to slowly back away, keeping his eyes on the advancing animal. "Nice bear," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and even. "You don't want to eat me. I'm all skin and bones. Probably taste terrible." For a brief moment, it seemed like his tactic might work. The bear paused, tilting its head as if considering Mark's words. But then, with a speed that belied its size, the bear charged. Mark's world narrowed to a pinpoint of terror. He turned to run, but his foot caught on a protruding root, sending him sprawling to the ground. He rolled onto his back just in time to see the bear looming over him, its hot breath washing over his face. In a desperate move, Mark kicked out with both feet, catching the bear in its chest. The impact was like hitting a brick wall, but it was enough to momentarily throw the animal off balance. Seizing the opportunity, Mark scrambled backwards, his hands scrabbling in the dirt for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a fallen branch, and he swung it wildly at the bear's face. The branch connected with a solid thwack, but it might as well have been a toothpick for all the damage it did. The bear swiped at Mark with one massive paw, its claws raking across his leg. White-hot pain exploded through Mark's body as the bear's claws tore through flesh and muscle. He screamed, the sound echoing through the forest. The coppery scent of blood filled the air, seeming to drive the bear into a frenzy. It lunged forward again, its jaws snapping inches from Mark's face. In that moment, staring death in the eye, something primal awakened in Mark. With strength born of sheer desperation, he drove his thumbs into the bear's eyes. The bear reared back with a roar of pain, shaking its massive head. Mark used the momentary reprieve to drag himself away, leaving a trail of blood on the forest floor. But the bear wasn't done. It advanced on Mark again, fury and pain evident in its movements. Mark braced himself for the final attack, closing his eyes and sending up a silent prayer. The sound of a gunshot shattered the air, followed by another. Mark's eyes flew open to see the bear stumbling backwards, confusion replacing the rage in its eyes. Two more shots rang out in quick succession, and the bear collapsed to the ground with a final, earth-shaking thud. For a moment, all was silent. Then Mark heard the sound of running footsteps approaching. A park ranger burst into view, rifle still at the ready. "Holy shit," the ranger breathed, taking in the scene before him. He quickly slung the rifle over his shoulder and rushed to Mark's side. "Sir, can you hear me? Are you all right?" Mark tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The world around him began to spin, shock and blood loss taking their toll. He was vaguely aware of the ranger calling for backup on his radio, of hands pressing something against his wounded leg. "Stay with me, sir." The ranger's voice seemed to come from far away. "Help is on the way. You're going to be okay." As consciousness began to slip away, Mark's last thoughts were of the bear. Even as it had attacked him, there had been something almost human in its eyes, a determination, a focus that went beyond mere animal instinct. It was as if the bear had specifically sought him out, driven by some need for vengeance. But that was crazy, wasn't it? Bears didn't seek revenge. They were animals, acting on instinct and hunger, weren't they? The sound of a helicopter grew louder, drowning out the ranger's continued reassurances. As the whirring of the blades filled his ears, Mark finally surrendered to the encroaching darkness. The image of the bear's eyes burned into his memory. When he next opened his eyes, Mark found himself in a sterile hospital room, the steady beep of monitors replacing the sounds of the forest. His leg throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and his entire body felt as if it had been put through a meat grinder. A nurse noticed he was awake and quickly came to his bedside. "Welcome back, Mr. Thompson," she said with a gentle smile. "You gave us quite a scare." Mark tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. The nurse held a cup of water to his lips, allowing him to take small sips. What happened?" he finally managed to croak out. "You were attacked by a bear in the Great Smoky Mountains," the nurse explained. "A park ranger found you just in time. You've been in and out of consciousness for the past day while we treated your injuries." As the nurse continued to explain the extent of his wounds and the surgeries he'd undergone, Mark's mind drifted back to the attack. The memory of the bear's eyes, filled with what he could only describe as hatred, sent a shiver down his spine. "The bear," he interrupted the nurse. "That's what happened to it." The nurse's expression turned somber. "I'm afraid the ranger had to put it down. It was the only way to save you." Mark nodded, a confusing mix of relief and sadness washing over him. He was alive, yes, but at the cost of a magnificent creature's life. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something unnatural about the whole encounter. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling of his hospital room, Mark knew that his life had been irrevocably changed. The scars on his body would heal, but the memory of those moments on the trail would stay with him forever. He had ventured into the wilderness, seeking peace and clarity, but had instead found a primal truth about nature and his place in it. The bear was gone, but its eyes still watched him from the shadows of his mind, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and the wild, between predator and prey. And as Mark drifted off into an uneasy sleep, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever feel truly safe in the woods again. Mark's hospital room was bathed in the soft glow of early morning light when he jerked awake, his heart racing. The remnants of a nightmare clung to his consciousness, visions of gleaming teeth and razor-sharp claws pursuing him through an endless forest. He took a deep breath, wincing at the pain that shot through his battered body. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his attempt to shake off the lingering fear. A middle-aged man in a park ranger uniform entered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Ranger Jim Hawkins. I was hoping we could talk about what happened out there on the trail." Mark nodded, gesturing for the ranger to take a seat. As Hawkins settled into the chair beside the bed, Mark noticed the man's eyes, flicking to the bandages covering his leg. "How are you holding up?" Hawkins asked, his voice gruff but kind. "I've been better," Mark replied with a weak smile. "But I'm alive, thanks to you. They told me you were the one who found me." Hawkins nodded, his expression grave. "It was a close call. In all my years as a ranger, I've never seen an attack quite like that. Black bears don't usually... well, they're not typically so aggressive." Mark's mind flashed back to the bears, eyes that unsettling glimmer of what had seemed like recognition. He shuddered involuntarily. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Hawkins continued. "Can you walk me through what happened? Every detail could be important." Mark took a deep breath and began recounting his encounter with the bear. He described the initial meeting by the stream, his attempt to use the bear spray, and the terrifying moments of the attack. As he spoke, he found himself hesitating when it came to describing the bear's behavior. "This might sound crazy," Mark said, his voice lowering, "but it felt like the bear was targeting me specifically, like it was angry about the spray and came back for revenge." He expected Hawkins to dismiss the idea outright, but the ranger's brow furrowed in thought. "You're not the first to suggest something like that," he said slowly. "We've had a few incidents in the past year that don't quite fit the usual pattern of bear behavior." Mark leaned forward, ignoring the protest from his aching muscles. "What do you mean?" Hawkins sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Nothing concrete. Just reports of bears acting more boldly, seeming to target specific campsites or hikers. Some folks have even claimed they've seen bears watching them from a distance, following them on the trails." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "Do you think there's something to it?" "Officially, no. We chalk it up to increased human activity in the park and bears getting too comfortable around people. But off the record..." Hawkins trailed off, his eyes distant. "I've been in these woods for 30 years, Mr. Thompson. I've seen things that don't always have easy explanations." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse entering to check Mark's vitals and administer pain medication. As she worked, Mark's mind raced with the implications of what Hawkins had shared. Could there really be something more to his encounter than a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Once the nurse left, Hawkins stood adjusting his hat. "I should get going, but listen, Mr. Thompson, when you're recovered, if you remember anything else or just want to talk, give me a call." He handed Mark a business card. "And be careful. Out there, the woods aren't always what they seem." As the door closed behind the ranger, Mark sank back into his pillows, his head spinning with a mixture of pain medication and unsettling thoughts. He closed his eyes, trying to find some peace, but all he could see was the bear's face, those eyes burning with an intelligence that shouldn't have been there. The next few days passed in a blur of medical checkups, pain management, and fitful sleep plagued by nightmares. Mark's leg wound was healing well, but the doctors warned him that he faced a long road of physical therapy to regain full use of the limb. On the fourth day after his conversation with Ranger Hawkins, Mark received another visitor. A local news reporter, Sarah Chen, had heard about the attack and was eager for an interview. "Mr. Thompson," she began, setting up a small recorder on his bedside table, "your story has captivated the local community. A man surviving a vicious bear attack. It's not something we hear about every day. Can you tell our listeners what was going through your mind during those terrifying moments?" Mark hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He thought back to Hawkins' words, the hint of something unexplained lurking in the forests of the Great Smoky Mountains. But as he looked at Sarah's expectant face, he realized how insane it would sound to suggest the bear had deliberately sought him out. "It all happened so fast," he said instead, sticking to a more conventional narrative. "One moment I was enjoying a peaceful hike, the next I was fighting for my life. I guess survival instinct just kicked in." Sarah nodded encouragingly, pressing for more details about the attack and Mark's daring escape. As he recounted the events, carefully omitting any mention of the bear's unnaturally focused behavior, Mark felt a strange sense of disconnect. It was as if he was telling someone else's story, a sanitized version that fit neatly into people's expectations of a man versus nature tale. "You're being hailed as a hero," Sarah said as the interview wound down. "People are saying your survival is nothing short of miraculous. How does that make you feel?" Mark forced a smile. "I don't feel like a hero. I'm just grateful to be alive and thankful for the brave park ranger who saved me. If anything, this experience has taught me to have a deeper respect for the power of nature." As Sarah packed up her equipment, thanking him for his time, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he'd somehow betrayed his own experience. The story he'd told was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The real story, the one about a bear with vengeance in its eyes, remained locked inside him, too fantastical for public consumption. Later that evening, as Mark channel surfed in an attempt to distract himself from his thoughts, he caught a glimpse of his own face on the local news. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Local man survives harrowing bear attack in National Park." He watched as clips from Sarah's interview played, interspersed with shots of the park and file footage of black bears. The story was neatly packaged, a thrilling tale of man's triumph over the dangers of the wild. But as Mark stared at his own image on the screen, he felt a deep unease settling in his gut. The Mark Thompson on TV was a hero, a survivor with an incredible story to tell. But the real Mark Thompson, the one lying in the hospital bed with scars both physical and mental, felt anything but heroic. He felt small, vulnerable, and increasingly certain that there was something out there in the woods that defied explanation. As he switched off the TV, his eyes fell on Ranger Hawkins' business card on the bedside table. Mark picked it up, running his thumb over the embossed letters. He knew that once he was out of the hospital, once the media frenzy died down and life began to return to normal, he would make that call. Because deep down he knew his encounter with the bear was just the beginning of a much larger, much stranger story. For now, though, Mark closed his eyes, bracing himself for the nightmares he knew would come. In his dreams, he was once again in the forest, pursued by a shadow with gleaming eyes and an all-too-human sense of purpose. And somewhere in the depths of the Great Smoky Mountains, something stirred, waiting for the day when paths would cross. Once more, the sun was setting over the Great Smoky Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, when Mark Thompson found himself alone on the trail once more. His leg, still bearing the scars of his encounter with the black bear, ached with each step, but he pressed on, driven by a mixture of determination and an almost compulsive need to confront his fears. It had been 6 months since the attack. 6 months of physical therapy, nightmares, and a growing obsession with understanding what had really happened that day. The media attention had faded, but the questions that gnawed at Mark's mind had only grown stronger. As he rounded a bend, in the trail, Mark's hand instinctively went to the satellite phone clipped to his belt. It was a precaution he'd never have thought necessary before, but now it represented a lifeline to the outside world. He paused, catching his breath and surveying his surroundings. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. "Get a grip, Thompson," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "You're jumping at shadows." But even as he tried to reassure himself, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was the same sensation he'd had in the moments before. The bear attacked, a prickling awareness that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the underbrush to his left. Mark whirled around, his heart pounding. "Hello!" he called out, his voice sounding thin and uncertain in the gathering twilight. "Is someone there?" There was no response, but the rustling in the bushes grew louder. Mark's fingers fumbled for the satellite phone, his mind racing. Should he call for help? But what would he say? That he was spooked by a noise in the woods? Before he could make a decision, a figure burst from the undergrowth. Mark stumbled backward, a cry of fear caught in his throat. But instead of the bear he'd been half expecting, he found himself face to face with a man. The stranger was disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, his beard wild and unkempt. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting around as if expecting danger from every direction. "You shouldn't be here," the man hissed, grabbing Mark's arm with surprising strength. "It's not safe. They're watching, always watching." Mark tried to pull away, his mind reeling. "Who's watching? What are you talking about?" The man's grip tightened, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The bears. They're not what you think. They remember. They plan. I've seen it." A chill ran down Mark's spine. The man's words echoed the thoughts that had been plaguing him for months, the suspicions he'd been too afraid to voice aloud. "What do you mean, they remember?" Mark asked, his own voice barely above a whisper now. The stranger's eyes locked onto Mark's, a glimmer of recognition sparking in their depths. "You've seen it too, haven't you? The intelligence in their eyes, the way they move with purpose." Mark nodded slowly, the memory of the bear's gaze flooding back. "I thought I was going crazy," he admitted. "No one would believe me." The man released Mark's arm, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "We're not safe here. Come with me. I have a camp nearby. I can show you what I've learned." Every instinct told Mark to turn and run, to dismiss this encounter as the ravings of a madman. But the pull of finally finding someone who understood, who might have answers, was too strong to resist. "Okay," Mark said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "Lead the way." As they moved deeper into the forest, following a barely visible path, the stranger introduced himself as Jack. He spoke in hushed tones, spinning a tale that sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. He talked of bears displaying unprecedented levels of intelligence, of coordinated attacks on campsites, of animals that seemed to communicate and strategize in ways that defied explanation. "It started about a year ago," Jack explained as they ducked under a low-hanging branch. "At first it was just little things, bears figuring out complex latches on food containers, seeming to understand and avoid trail cameras. But then he trailed off as they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a makeshift shelter, surrounded by what looked like a cross between a research station and a conspiracy theorist's lair. Maps of the park were pinned to trees, covered in red marks and scribbled notes. A battered laptop sat on a folding table, surrounded by stacks of notebooks. "Then what?" Mark prompted, his eyes scanning the bizarre scene before him. Jack moved to one of the maps, pointing to a cluster of red marks. Then the attack started, not random, not driven by hunger or territorial instincts, targeted, precise. He turned to Mark, his eyes burning with intensity. "They're hunting us, Mr. Thompson, and they're learning." As Jack launched into a detailed explanation of his theories, showing Mark his notes and the patterns he'd identified. A part of Mark's mind screamed that this was insanity. But another part, the part that still woke up in a cold sweat remembering the bear's eyes, found itself nodding along. Hours passed as Jack shared his research. He had records of bear sightings, attack reports, and even grainy video footage that seemed to show bears engaging in eerily coordinated behavior. As the night wore on, Mark found his skepticism eroding, replaced by a growing sense of dread. But why? Mark asked finally, his voice hoarse from talking. Why would they suddenly start behaving this way? Jack shook his head, running a hand through his tangled hair. I don't know. Climate change. Some kind of environmental factor we haven't identified yet. Or maybe. He hesitated, seeming unsure whether to continue. Maybe what? Mark pressed. Maybe they've always been capable of this, Jack said softly, and they've just decided it's time to reclaim their territory. A heavy silence fell over the camp. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound eerily reminiscent of a warning cry. Mark shivered, suddenly acutely aware of how vulnerable they were out here in the darkness. What do we do with this information? He asked finally. Jack's expression hardened. We gather more evidence, we make people believe, and we prepare. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Mark realized he had a decision to make. He could walk away from this, dismiss it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. He could return to his life, in Knoxville, try to forget about the attack and move on. Or he could stay. He could join Jack in his quest for answers, dive deeper into this mystery that defied logic, but resonated with his deepest fears. Mark thought of the satellite phone on his belt, of the people waiting for him back in the city who would never understand what he'd discovered here. Then he thought of the bear's eyes, of the intelligence and purpose he'd seen there. Okay, he said finally, meeting Jack's gaze. Where do we start? As the sun rose over the Great Smoky Mountains, casting long shadows through the ancient forest, two men bent over a map, planning their next move in a conflict they barely understood. And somewhere in the depths of the woods, unseen eyes watched and waited. The whirring of helicopter blades cut through the still mountain air, growing louder with each passing second. Mark Thompson huddled against a large boulder, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The gashes on his leg throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage he'd fashioned from his torn shirt. Just hold on, he muttered to himself, straining to hear any signs of approaching rescuers over the sound of the helicopter. They're coming. You're going to make it out of this. The events of the past few hours played on a loop in his mind. The bear's sudden appearance, the terror of the attack, the desperate struggle for survival. Mark's hand unconsciously went to the empty clip on his belt where the bear spray had been. Its absence felt like a cruel joke now. A voice crackled through the trees, distant but unmistakable. Hello, is anyone there? Mark's heart leaped. Here, he shouted, his voice hoarse. I'm over here. The sound of rustling undergrowth and snapping. Twigs grew closer. Suddenly, a figure in a park ranger uniform burst into view, his eyes quickly locking onto Mark's huddled form. I've found him, the ranger called over his shoulder before rushing to Mark's side. Sir, are you all right? Can you tell me your name? Mark Thompson, he managed, wincing as the ranger began to examine his leg. I was attacked by a bear. It came out of nowhere. I couldn't... It's okay, Mr. Thompson, the ranger soothed, his practiced hands already working to apply a proper dressing to the wound. You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here. More figures emerged from the forest, paramedics carrying a stretcher and medical supplies. They swarmed around Mark, their voices a blur of medical jargon and reassurances. An IV was inserted into his arm, pain medication flooding his system and dulling the sharp edges of his awareness. As they prepared to move him onto the stretcher, Mark grabbed the ranger's arm. The bear, he said urgently. It's still out there. It was like it was hunting me. You have to warn people. The ranger exchanged a glance with one of the paramedics before patting Mark's hand. Don't worry about that now, sir. We'll take care of everything. You just focus on staying still while we get you to the chopper. The world tilted and swayed as they lifted the stretcher. Mark caught glimpses of the forest canopy above, sunlight filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns. The pain in his leg had faded to a distant throb, replaced by a floating sensation. That made everything seem slightly unreal. As they neared the waiting helicopter, its rotors kicking up a wind that whipped through the clearing, Mark's thoughts drifted back to the bear. There had been something in its eyes, a focused intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. He needed to make them understand. "Listen," he called out, struggling to raise his voice over the noise of the helicopter. It wasn't a normal attack. The bear, it was different. It was like it knew me, like it was angry about the spray. One of the paramedics leaned in close as they secured the stretcher. "It's all right, Mr. Thompson. You're in shock. Try to relax and let the medication do its work." But Mark couldn't relax. As they lifted him into the helicopter, he caught sight of the forest stretching out below. Somewhere in those woods, the bear was still out there. And Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The interior of the helicopter was a flurry of activity as they took off. A flight medic attached monitors to Mark's chest, calling out readings to the pilot. Through the haze of medication, Mark tried to focus on the faces around him, to make them listen. "You don't understand," he insisted, his words slurring slightly. "It wasn't just a random attack. The bear, it came back for me. It remembered." The flight medic patted his shoulder, reassuringly. "Bears don't seek revenge, Mr. Thompson. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's normal to try to make sense of it. But right now, we need you to stay calm and let us take care of you." Mark wanted to argue, to make them see, but exhaustion was creeping in, amplified by the pain medication. As the helicopter soared over the mountains, carrying him towards safety and medical care, his eyes began to drift closed. In his last moments of consciousness, Mark's mind replayed the image of the bear's eyes, filled with that unsettling glimmer of recognition. He knew with a certainty that went bone deep that what had happened in those woods was anything but normal. And as darkness claimed him, Mark silently vowed that he would find a way to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The steady beep of a heart monitor pulled Mark back to awareness. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room. The pain in his leg had dulled to a persistent ache, and he could feel the tug of an IV in his arm. A nurse noticed he was awake and approached his bedside, her smile professional and reassuring. "Welcome back, Mr. Thompson. How are you feeling?" Mark licked his dry lips, his voice coming out as a croak. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly and lost." The nurse chuckled as she checked his vitals. "Well, from what I hear, you held your own pretty well against that black bear. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your injuries and treatment plan." As the nurse busied herself with adjusting his IV, Mark's mind raced. He needed to talk to someone who would listen, someone who might understand what he'd experienced. "Out there, excuse me," he said, catching the nurse's attention. "Is there any way I could speak to the park ranger who found me, or someone from the wildlife service?" The nurse's brow furrowed slightly. "I'm not sure about that, Mr. Thompson, but I can ask the doctor if it would be all right for you to have visitors. Is there family we should contact for you?" Mark shook his head. No family, but please, if you could find out about the ranger, I'd really appreciate it." After the nurse left, promising to see what she could do, Mark was left alone with his thoughts. He stared out the window at the sliver of sky visible between buildings, wondering if anyone would believe what he had to say. The bear's eyes haunted him, that spark of intelligence and purpose that defied explanation. A soft knock at the door interrupted his musings. A middle-aged man in a crisp white coat entered, a tablet in hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Patel. I'm the lead surgeon who worked on your leg." "How are you feeling?" Mark straightened up as best he could. "Better, I think. Doctor, I need to talk to someone about what happened out there. It wasn't a normal bear attack." Dr. Patel's expression was kind, but skeptical. "Mr. Thompson, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's normal to have vivid memories and to try to make sense of what happened. But right now, our priority is your physical recovery." As the doctor launched into an explanation of Mark's injuries and the surgeries he'd undergone, Mark felt a growing frustration. He knew what he had seen, what he had experienced, but how could he make anyone understand when it sounded so implausible, so fantastical? "Doctor," Mark interrupted, his voice firm despite his weakened state, "I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I need you to listen. What happened out there wasn't just a random animal attack. There was something different about that. Bear, something that doesn't make sense. Dr. Patel paused, studying Mark's face intently. After a moment, he sighed and pulled up a chair. "All right, Mr. Thompson, why don't you tell me exactly what you remember?" And so Mark began to recount his experience. He described the initial encounter, the bear's behavior after the spray, and the terrifying moments of the attack. As he spoke, he could see the doubt in Dr. Patel's eyes, but he pressed on, determined to make anyone understand the gravity of what he had witnessed. As Mark finished his story, a heavy silence fell over the room. Dr. Patel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Thompson, I can see that you truly believe what you're saying, and I won't dismiss your experience, but I think it's important that we consider the effects of trauma and stress on memory and perception." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Dr. Patel held up a hand. "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just suggesting that we focus on your recovery for now. Once you're feeling better, if you still feel strongly about this, we can look into arranging for you to speak with wildlife experts or park officials." It wasn't the response Mark had hoped for, but it was a start. He nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over him. "Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate you listening." As Dr. Patel stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Get some rest, Mr. Thompson. You've been through a lot. We'll talk more when you're stronger." Left alone once more, Mark stared at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He knew that his road to recovery would be long, both physically and mentally. But as he drifted off into a fitful sleep, one thought remained clear. He would find a way to uncover the truth about what was happening in those mountains, no matter how long it took or how crazy it made him sound. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room cast a sickly glow over Mark Thompson's pale face as he stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. It had been a week since the bear attack, and while his physical wounds were slowly healing, the psychological impact of the encounter weighed heavily on his mind. A gentle knock on the door roused Mark from his reverie. He turned his head to see Dr. Patel entering, a tablet in hand and a cautious smile on his face. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How are you feeling today?" Mark attempted a weak smile. "About as well as can be expected, I suppose. Any chance I'll be getting out of here soon?" Dr. Patel pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. Your wounds are healing nicely, and we think you're ready to start the next phase of your recovery." As the doctor launched into an explanation of the physical therapy regimen Mark would need to follow, Mark's mind drifted back to the woods, to the bear's eyes, and the inexplicable sense of recognition he'd seen there. "Mr. Thompson?" Dr. Patel's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you with me?" Mark blinked, focusing on the doctor's concerned face. "Sorry, I was just thinking about what happened." "Doctor, have you had any luck reaching out to the wildlife services or the park rangers? I really need to talk to someone about what I saw out there." Dr. Patel's expression softened with sympathy. "I understand this is important to you, Mr. Thompson. I've made some inquiries, but these things take time. For now, I think it's crucial that we focus on your physical recovery." Mark nodded, trying to hide his frustration. He knew the doctor meant well, but the need to make someone understand the true nature of his encounter was becoming all-consuming. As Dr. Patel stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Oh, I almost forgot. There's a reporter here who's been asking to speak with you. A Sarah Chen from the local news station. I told her it was up to you if you felt up to an interview." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Here, finally, was a chance to share his story. "Yes," he said, perhaps too eagerly. "Yes, I'd like to speak with her." An hour later, Sarah Chen entered the room, her professional demeanor barely concealing her excitement. At landing the interview, she set up a small recorder on the bedside table and settled into the chair beside Mark. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice warm and engaging, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Your story has captivated our local community. Can you take us through what happened that day in the Great Smoky Mountains?" Mark took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. He knew how crazy the truth would sound, how easily it could be dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized victim. But he also knew that this might be his only chance to get his message out. "It all happened so fast," he started, sticking to the facts at first. He described the initial encounter by the stream, his attempt to use the bear spray, and the terrifying moments of the attack. Sarah nodded encouragingly, scribbling notes as he spoke, but as Mark reached the part about the bear's return, about the look in its eyes, he hesitated. The weight of his next words hung in the air. "Mr. Thompson?" Sarah prompted gently. What happened next? Mark met her gaze, his voice low and intense. "The bear came back, Miss Chen. It hunted me. And there was something in its eyes. An intelligence, a purpose. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It knew me. It remembered." Sarah's pen paused over her notepad, her brow furrowing slightly. "Are you saying the bear deliberately sought you out?" "I know how it sounds," Mark said quickly. "But I'm telling you, this wasn't a normal animal encounter. There's something happening in those mountains, something that doesn't make sense." Sarah's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing a mix of skepticism and concern. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. It's natural to try to make sense of such a terrifying event." Mark felt a surge of frustration. "I'm not crazy, Miss Chen. I know what I saw. Something is changing in those woods, and people need to be warned." Sarah's expression softened. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. No one's suggesting you're crazy. You've survived a harrowing ordeal, and your story is remarkable." She skillfully steered the conversation back to safer ground, asking about his recovery and plans for the future. As the interview wound down, Mark felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He'd tried to tell the truth, but he could see in Sarah's eyes that she didn't believe him, at least not about the most important part. After Sarah left, promising that the interview would air in a few days, Mark was left alone with his thoughts. He stared out the window at the city skyline, feeling more isolated than ever. How could he make people understand what he'd experienced when it sounded so fantastical? The next few days passed in a blur of physical therapy sessions and visits from hospital staff. Mark threw himself into his exercises, pushing his body to recover, driven by a growing determination to get back to the mountains and find proof of what he'd seen. Finally, the evening of the interview broadcast arrived. Mark sat in his hospital bed, remote in hand, a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in his stomach as he waited for the segment to air. Sarah Chen's familiar face appeared on the screen, her voice serious as she introduced the story. A routine hike turned into a fight for survival for one Knoxville man. Mark Thompson's encounter with a black bear in the Great Smoky Mountains is a harrowing tale of man versus nature. As Mark watched, his heart sank. The story that unfolded on the screen was a sanitized version of events, focused on the drama of the attack and his miraculous survival. His comments about the bear's unusual behavior had been reduced to a brief mention of the unpredictability of wildlife. When the segment ended, Mark switched off the TV, a bitter taste in his mouth. The story had been neatly packaged for public consumption, stripped of anything that might challenge people's understanding of the natural world. He reached for the bedside table, picking up the business card Ranger Hawkins had given him days earlier. His finger traced the embossed letters as he considered his next move. The media might not be ready to hear the truth, but perhaps there were others out there who would listen, who might have seen or experienced similar things. As night fell over the city, Mark made a silent vow. He would recover, he would return to the mountains, and he would find the truth about what was happening in those woods. The bear's eyes still haunted his dreams, a reminder of the mystery that lay waiting in the depths of the Great Smoky Mountains. And Mark Thompson was determined to solve it, no matter the cost. The local news station studio buzzed with activity as the crew prepared for the evening broadcast. Sarah Chen sat at her desk, reviewing her notes one last time before going on air. Her interview with Mark Thompson, the survivor of a vicious bear attack in the Great Smoky Mountains, had been playing on her mind for days. 2 minutes to air. "Sarah," called out the floor manager. Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath to center herself. As she made her way to the news desk, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was missing something important about Thompson's story. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Sarah put on her professional smile. "Good evening, Knoxville. Our top story tonight. A local man's harrowing encounter with a black bear in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park." As the segment began to roll, featuring clips from her interview with Mark, interspersed with stock footage of bears and the National Park. Sarah found herself watching with a critical eye. The story that unfolded was compelling, a man versus nature tale of survival against the odds. But it felt incomplete, sanitized. After the broadcast, Sarah lingered in the studio, replaying parts of the raw interview footage. Mark's words echoed in her head. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct, it knew me, it remembered. Her producer, Mike, approached with a cup of coffee. "Great job tonight, Sarah. That bear attack story is going to get a lot of traction." Sarah accepted the coffee with a distracted smile. "Thanks, Mike, but I can't help feeling like we missed something important." Mike raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? We gave the viewers exactly what they want, drama, danger, a happy ending. What more is there?" Sarah hesitated, knowing how it would sound. Thompson was convinced there was more to the attack than just bad luck. He talked about the bear having some kind of intelligence, a purpose. Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, Sarah. The guy had just been through a traumatic experience. People say all kinds of crazy things when they're in shock." I know, Sarah sighed. "But what if there's something to it? What if there's a bigger story here that we're not seeing?" Mike's expression softened. "Look, I get it. You're a journalist. You want to dig deeper. But sometimes a bear attack is just a bear attack. Don't go chasing conspiracy theories when we've got a perfectly good human interest story right here." As Mike walked away, Sarah turned back to her computer, pulling up recent reports of bear activity in the Great Smoky Mountains. Most were routine, sightings on trails, raids on improperly stored food. But as she dug deeper, she began to notice a pattern. Over the past year, there had been a subtle increase in unusual bear behaviors, more frequent encounters with humans, more aggressive responses to deterrence. Her phone buzzed with a text from her cameraman, Jake. "Hey, heard you're still at the studio. Want to grab a drink and decompress?" Sarah glanced at the clock, surprised to see how late it had gotten. She texted back quickly, "Rain check. I'm onto something here." Hours passed as Sarah fell down a rabbit hole of research. She compiled a list of recent bear encounters in the park, noting any details that seemed out of the ordinary. By the time she looked up again, the first light of dawn was creeping through the studio windows. Rubbing her tired eyes, Sarah made a decision. She needed to talk to Mark Thompson again, to hear his full story without the constraints of a pre-packaged news segment. And then perhaps a trip to the Great Smoky Mountains was in order. Later that morning, Sarah found herself back at the hospital. Mark looked surprised to see her as she entered his room. "Ms. Chen, I didn't expect to see you again. I caught your segment last night." Sarah could hear the hint of disappointment in his voice. She took a seat beside his bed, her expression serious. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. I don't think I gave your story the attention it deserved. I'm here to listen. Really listen if you're willing to tell me everything again." Mark studied her face, as if searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Ms. Chen, but this time I need you to keep an open mind. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I swear to you it's the truth." For the next hour, Mark recounted his experience in detail, holding nothing back. He described the bear's behavior, the look in its eyes, the sense that it was hunting him specifically. As he spoke, Sarah found herself believing him, despite the rational part of her mind that insisted it was impossible. "I know how it sounds," Mark said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I'm telling you, there's something happening in those mountains that doesn't make sense, and I'm afraid that if someone doesn't take it seriously, more people are going to get hurt." Sarah leaned forward, her journalistic instincts fully engaged. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you, and I want to help get to the bottom of this. But we're going to need more than just your word. We need evidence." Mark's eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and determination. "So you'll investigate? You'll look into what's really going on out there?" Sarah nodded, already mentally planning. Her next steps. "I'll do my best. But I need you to understand this isn't going to be easy. A lot of people aren't going to want to hear this. We'll be up against a lot of skepticism." "I know," Mark said softly. "But someone has to try to uncover the truth. Those bears, whatever's happening to them, it's not their fault, and it's not going to stop on its own." As Sarah left the hospital, her mind was racing with possibilities. She knew she was potentially jeopardizing her career by pursuing this story, but something in Mark's eyes, in the earnestness of his voice, compelled her to dig deeper. She pulled out her phone, dialing her cameraman. "Jake, it's Sarah. How do you feel about a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sure. Sounds fun. What's the occasion?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing how it would sound. "We're going bear hunting, but not in the way you might think. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just keep an open mind, okay?" As she hung up, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple news story. But the thrill of uncovering the truth, of potentially saving lives, outweighed her fears. In her mind, she could still see the intensity in Mark Thompson's eyes as he recounted his experience. Whatever was happening in the Great Smoky Mountains, Sarah Chen was determined to bring it to light no matter the cost. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Mark Thompson's living room as he stood by the window, gazing out at the Knoxville skyline. It had been 6 months since the bear attack in the Great Smoky Mountains, and while his physical scars had faded to pale lines, the memory remained as vivid as ever. Mark absently rubbed his leg where the bear's claws had left. "There, Mark." The limp was barely noticeable now, thanks to months of grueling physical therapy, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. He hadn't set foot on a hiking trail since that day, the thought of entering the woods enough to send his heart racing. Gentle knock at the door pulled Mark from his reverie. He opened it to find Sarah Chen, the local news reporter who had interviewed him in the hospital, standing there with a tentative smile. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted him. "Thanks for agreeing to see me again." Mark stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. "Please call me Mark, come in." As they settled into the living room, an awkward silence fell between them. Sarah's eyes darted to the framed photos on the wall, images of Mark on various hiking trails, his face alight with the joy of the outdoors. The contrast with the man sitting before her now was stark. "How have you been, Mark?" Sarah finally asked, her voice soft with concern. Mark managed a wry smile. "Physically, better every day. Mentally?" He shook his head. "That's a bit more complicated," Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I can imagine. Listen, I wanted to apologize again for how we handled your story initially. I've been doing some digging since then and, well, I think you might have been onto something." Mark leaned forward, a spark of interest lighting his eyes for the first time. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Sarah pulled out a tablet, swiping through a series of documents and photos. "I've been compiling reports of unusual bear behavior in the Great Smoky Mountains over the past year. There's been an increase in encounters, and some of the details, they're not typical." As Sarah shared her findings, Mark felt a mixture of vindication and unease wash over him. The incidents she described, bears displaying problem-solving skills to access food storage, seemingly coordinated movements around campsites, and encounters where hikers reported feeling watched, aligned eerily with his own experience. "So, you believe me now?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I believe something unusual is happening out there. But Mark, we need more than just anecdotes and scattered reports. We need solid evidence if we're going to make people take this seriously." Mark stood abruptly, pacing the room. The thought of returning to the mountains sent a shiver down his spine, but the need to uncover the truth, to prevent others from experiencing what he had, burned even stronger. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah took a deep breath. "I want to go back out there into the park, set up cameras, gather data, but I need someone who knows those trails, someone who's experienced. This firsthand." She paused, watching Mark carefully. "I need you, Mark." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the decision before him. Mark's gaze drifted to the hiking boots gathering dust by the door, then to the scars on his hands, reminders of his desperate fight for survival. Finally, he turned back to Sarah. "If we do this, we do it smart. We prepare, we take precautions. I'm not risking anyone else's life on this." Sarah nodded, relief and excitement mingling in her expression. "Of course. We'll take every precaution. I've already reached out to some wildlife experts who are interested in our findings. They can provide guidance and equipment. As they spent the next hour outlining their plan, Mark felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation building within him. The idea of facing his fears, of potentially uncovering a truth that could change how people viewed wildlife, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as she prepared to leave. "I think we should try to contact that park ranger who rescued you. Ranger Hawkins, right? He might have insights that could help us." Mark nodded, remembering the gruff but kind ranger who had saved his life. Good idea. He seemed open to the possibility that there was more to the story. As Sarah left, promising to be in touch with more details soon, Mark found himself alone with his thoughts once more. He walked to the bookshelf, pulling out a worn trail guide to the Great Smoky Mountains. His fingers traced the familiar routes, memories of past hikes flooding back. For the first time in months, Mark felt a glimmer of his old self returning. The fear was still there, a constant presence in the back of his mind, but it was tempered now by a sense of purpose. He picked up his phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing a number he'd memorized but never used. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Ranger Hawkins speaking." Mark took a deep breath. "Ranger Hawkins, this is Mark Thompson. You rescued me from a bear attack 6 months ago. I think I'm ready to talk about what really happened out there." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a soft chuckle. "Took you long enough, son. I've been waiting for this call. Let's meet up and have a real conversation about what's going on in those mountains." As Mark hung up, he felt a shift in the air, as if the universe had realigned itself. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, possibly dangerous, but for the first time since the attack, he felt like he was on the right path. Outside his window, the Great Smoky Mountains loomed in the distance, shrouded in their eternal mist. Somewhere in those ancient forests, answers awaited. And Mark Thompson was finally ready to seek them out, to face his fears and uncover the truth, not just for himself, but for all those who ventured into the wild, unaware of the changes taking place in the natural world. As night fell over Knoxville, Mark found himself looking at his hiking boots with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. Tomorrow he would start preparing for a journey back into the heart of the mountains. This time, he wouldn't be caught unprepared. This time, he was going in search of answers, armed with knowledge, technology, and a determination to understand. The mysterious forces at work in the wilderness he once loved, the bear that had attacked him, had long since vanished into the depths of the forest, continuing its inscrutable existence. But the memory of its eyes, filled with that unsettling intelligence, remained burned into Mark's mind. It was a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown, between the world as humans understood it and the deeper mysteries of nature that still eluded comprehension. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Mark's dreams were filled, not with the usual nightmares of teeth and claws, but with visions of misty mountain trails and the promise of discovery. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, to reclaim his place in the wilderness, and perhaps in doing so, to heal the deepest wounds left by his encounter with the unknown.